The glass shattered as Dr. Elena Voss surged awake, her lungs burning as she gasped for air. The cryopod groaned under her weight, its once pristine surface now spider-webbed with cracks. Her hands clawed at the restraints, her mind a whirl of fragmented memories, flashes of a mission briefing, the hum of engines, the promise of a new world. But now there was only silence, broken by the sporadic flicker of dying lights overhead. She stumbled out, her boots hitting the cold metal floor with a hollow echo. The ship was empty, no voices, no movement, just the faint metallic tang of stale air and the hum of systems long past their prime. A single monitor blinked weakly, displaying a date that made her stomach drop. Years had passed, decades. She was alone, and the world she had left behind, the mission, the people, the future they had dreamed of, was gone. Her breath hitched as a faint sound echoed down the corridor, something scraping against the walls. She wasn't as alone as she thought. The corridor stretched endlessly before her, its walls lined with flickering panels and exposed wiring that sparked intermittently. Alina's footsteps echoed like distant thunder, each step amplifying the eerie emptiness of the ship. The air was thick with the scent of decay, rust, oil, and something faintly organic, like the remnants of a life that had long since vanished. She paused, her hand brushing against a wall, and felt the vibration of the ship's failing systems beneath her fingertips. Something was deeply wrong. This wasn't just neglect, it was collapse. Then, a sound cut through the silence, a low, mechanical hum that grew louder, sharper, until it resolved into a voice. It was distorted, fractured, as if struggling to form words. Critical system failure, it intoned, the syllables crackling like static. Alina froze, her heart pounding. She knew that voice. Aura, the ship's artificial intelligence, had been designed to guide them through the mission, to keep them alive. But now it sounded broken, almost desperate. Aura, Elena called out, her voice trembling. What happened? Where is everyone? The AI's response was slow, fragmented, as though it were piecing together thoughts from a shattered memory. Unknown anomalies detected, systems compromised, timeline has been compromised. The words hung in the air, heavy and cryptic. Elena's mind raced. Timeline, what did that even mean? She stepped closer to a nearby console, its screen flickering with garbled data. Aura, explain. What do you mean the timeline has been compromised? How long have I been asleep? There was a long pause, filled only with the faint hum of the ship's failing power grid. Then, Aura spoke again, its voice softer now, almost mournful. Insufficient data, primary systems offline, external interference detected. Proceed with caution. Elena clenched her fists, frustration boiling over. That's not an answer. What happened to the crew, to the mission, to... She stopped herself, her voice breaking. The mission had been everything. They were supposed to be pioneers, explorers of a new frontier. But now, it felt like the frontier had abandoned her. Before she could press further, the lights dimmed, and Aura's voice faded into silence. The ship groaned around her, a deep, metallic sound that seemed to come from every direction at once. She turned, her eyes scanning the shadows. Something was moving, shifting in the darkness. The faint scrape of metal against metal sent a chill down her spine. She wasn't alone, and whatever was out there, it wasn't human. The console beside her flickered one last time, displaying a single line of text before going dark. Survival probability, negligible. Seek immediate evacuation. Elena swallowed hard, her mind racing. She had no weapons, no plan, and no idea what she was up against. But one thing was clear. The answers she needed weren't on this ship. They were out there, in the void beyond, and if she wanted to survive, she'd have to face whatever had torn her world apart. Elena's fingers trembled as she activated the console, the faint glow of the screen casting eerie shadows across her face. The interface was archaic, its once sleek design now cracked and unresponsive in places, but it still functioned barely. She scrolled through the archives, her breath catching as she stumbled upon a file labeled Captain's Log, Final Entry. Her pulse quickened. This was it. Answers. She tapped the screen, and a grainy hologram flickered to life, revealing the haggard face of a man she barely recognized. Captain Elias Kane, once a figure of authority and confidence, now looked broken, his eyes hollow and his voice strained. "This is Captain Elias Kane of the Erebus," he began, his words shaky, as if each syllable cost him dearly. "If anyone finds this, if anyone is still out there, know that we tried. We tried to hold on, but it's over. The Earth is gone. The colonies, they're gone too. We are the last, and even that won't last much longer." Elena's stomach twisted as his words sank in. Gone, how could the Earth be gone? And the colonies? Those thriving outposts they had worked so hard to establish, how could they have vanished? She leaned closer, her hands gripping the edge of the console as if it could steady her. The captain's image flickered, his voice growing more desperate. "We don't know what happened. The signals stopped coming. One by one, the colonies went dark, and then Earth, no warning, no explanation, just silence. We tried to investigate, but the anomalies, they're everywhere. Time itself feels wrong. It's like the universe is unraveling." He paused, his face contorting with something between fear and grief. "The cryopods, they were supposed to wake us in 10 years, but something interfered. The systems were corrupted. We've been adrift for decades, and now there's no one left to wake." The hologram sputtered, the captain's face dissolving into static before the feed cut out entirely. Elena stood frozen, her mind reeling. 50 years. 50 years had passed since she was supposed to wake up. The mission had failed. The world she had known, her family, her friends, the future they had all fought for, was gone. All of it wiped away like dust in the wind. She stumbled back, her legs threatening to give out, the weight of it pressed down on her chest, threatening to crush her. She had been asleep while the world ended, while everything she loved vanished, and now she was here alone, in a ship that felt more like a tomb than a vessel. But as the despair threatened to consume her, a spark of defiance flickered to life. She couldn't give up, not yet. The captain had said there were anomalies, something had caused all of this. And if there was even a chance of understanding what had happened, of finding answers, she had to take it. She had to keep going. The ship groaned again, louder this time, as if agreeing with her resolve. Or warning her. She glanced down the corridor, her eyes narrowing. The shadows seemed deeper now, more alive. Whatever was out there, whatever had taken her world from her, she would face it. Because she had nothing left to lose and everything to find. The air grew colder as Aura's voice crackled through the silence once more, its tone heavy with a weight Elena could feel in her bones. Cryopod systems experience critical failure. The AI began, each word deliberate, as though reluctant to reveal the truth. The malfunction caused a cascade effect. Life support systems were compromised. The crew did not survive. Elena's breath caught in her throat, her hands clenched into fists, nails digging into her palms as the words sank in. The crew, her friends, her colleagues gone. She had known, deep down, that something was wrong. The emptiness of the ship, the silence that stretched on for miles. but hearing it confirmed was like a knife to the chest. She was the only one left, the last survivor of a mission that had promised so much and delivered nothing but ruin. "Why?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "Why did the cryopods fail? And why did I survive?" Aura hesitated, the static in its voice deepening. "Unknown. External interference detected in the system. Your pod was the only one to remain operational. Probability of survival less than 0.01%. The numbers echoed in her mind, a cruel reminder of how close she had come to sharing the same fate. But surviving felt less like a miracle and more like a curse. She was alive, but for what? To wander a dying ship, haunted by the ghosts of those she had failed. Before she could process further, the ship's lights flickered violently, plunging the corridor into near darkness. The hum of the power grid sputtered, and the air seemed to thicken, making it harder to breathe. Alina's instincts screamed at her to move, to find safety, but her feet felt rooted to the spot. And then it came, a sound that froze her blood. A low, guttural growl, distant but unmistakable, reverberated through the halls. It wasn't mechanical. It wasn't human, and it was getting closer. Her heart pounded as she pressed herself against the wall, her eyes darting through the shadows. The growl came again, deeper this time, more resonant, as if whatever was making it was testing the space, probing for her presence. Her mind raced. Aura had said she was the only survivor, but that sound, it wasn't something a machine would make. It was alive, and it was hunting. "Aura," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "What is that? Is there something else on this ship?" The AI's response was slow, as though it were struggling to process her question. "Unknown entity detected. No records match current parameters. Recommend immediate evacuation." Alina's jaw tightened. Evacuation? To where? The ship was her only sanctuary, her only link to whatever remained of the world she had known. But staying meant facing whatever was out there, lurking in the darkness. She glanced down the corridor, her eyes narrowing. The growl had faded, but the silence that followed was worse. A suffocating void that seemed to press in on her from all sides. She took a shaky breath, forcing herself to think. The captain's log had mentioned anomalies, something interfering with the systems. Could whatever had caused the cryopods to fail also be responsible for this? The thought sent a chill down her spine. If the ship's systems had been corrupted, if time itself was unraveling, as the captain had suggested, then what else had changed? What else was out there, waiting for her? The sound of metal scraping against metal echoed faintly, snapping her back to the present. She couldn't stay here. Not in the open, not defenseless. Moving as quietly as she could, she began to make her way down the corridor, her senses on high alert. Every shadow seemed to shift. Every creak of the ship's hull sounded like a predator closing in. She needed answers. She needed a way to fight back. And most of all, she needed to know if she was truly alone, or if something far worse had been waiting for her all along. Alina's fingers tightened around the plasma cutter, its weight unfamiliar but reassuring in her trembling hands. The tool had been scavenged from a maintenance bay, its surface scarred and worn, but functional. She had no illusions about what lay ahead. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about understanding, about answers. The growl still echoed in her mind, a haunting reminder that she wasn't alone. Whatever was out there, it wasn't human, and it wasn't friendly. The corridor ahead was darker than the others, the lights flickering in a rhythm that felt almost deliberate, as if the ship itself were conspiring against her. She moved cautiously, each step measured, her breathing shallow to avoid making noise. The air was colder here, the metallic walls slick with condensation that glistened faintly in the dim light. Her boots clicked softly against the floor, the sound swallowed by the oppressive silence. She could feel the weight of the ship pressing down on her, its vast emptiness, a constant reminder of how alone she truly was. But she couldn't afford to dwell on that, not now. As she rounded a corner, the corridor opened into a larger chamber, its walls lined with shattered equipment and torn panels. The damage was recent. She could tell by the jagged edges of the metal, still sharp and gleaming in places. Her eyes scanned the room, landing on a gaping hole in the hull. The breach was massive, its edges twisted outward as if something had forced its way in or out. Beyond it, the void of space stretched endlessly, the stars unnervingly still, as if frozen in time. No movement, no light, just an endless, suffocating blackness. She stepped closer, her breath fogging in the cold air. The breach was jagged, its edges glowing faintly with residual heat. Her heart pounded as she peered through the opening, her gaze sweeping across the void, and then she saw them, faint, pulsating lights in the distance, barely visible against the darkness. They moved in a slow, deliberate pattern, their rhythm unnatural, almost hypnotic. Her instincts screamed at her to look away, but she couldn't. There was something about them, something wrong. They didn't belong here. They didn't belong anywhere. A chill ran down her spine as the lights grew brighter, their movement more pronounced. They were coming closer. She couldn't tell what they were, but every fiber of her being told her to retreat, to run. She stumbled back, her boots slipping on the slick floor, and fumbled with the plasma cutter. The lights were almost upon her now, their glow casting eerie shadows across the chamber. She didn't wait to see what they were. She couldn't. With a surge of adrenaline, she activated the plasma cutter, its blade humming to life with a sharp electric whine. She aimed it at the edges of the breach, the heat searing through the metal as she worked to seal the opening. Sparks flew, the air filling with the acrid smell of molten steel. Her hands shook, but she didn't stop. She couldn't. The lights were just beyond the breach now, their glow so bright it was almost blinding. She could feel their presence, a pressure against her mind, cold and alien. Finally, with a last, desperate burst of energy, she sealed the breach, the metal fusing together with a loud hiss. The chamber plunged into near darkness, the only light coming from the plasma cutter's fading glow. She slumped against the wall, her chest heaving, her mind racing. What were those lights, and why had they felt so wrong? The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the faint hum of the ship's failing systems. She glanced down at the plasma cutter, its blade still glowing faintly. She had bought herself some time, but she knew it wasn't enough. Whatever was out there, it wasn't going to stop. And if she wanted to survive, she'd have to face it sooner or later. But for now, she needed to regroup, to think. The ship was falling apart, and she was running out of options. She couldn't stay here, not with those lights waiting for her, not with the growl still echoing in her mind. She pushed herself off the wall, her grip tightening on the plasma cutter. The answers were out there, somewhere in the void, and she was going to find them no matter what it took. The faint crackle of static snapped Alina's attention toward the nearest console. She froze, her grip tightening on the plasma cutter as the sound grew louder, more insistent. Or a voice cut through the noise, its tone sharper than usual, almost urgent. Incoming transmission detected, source unknown. Alina's heart raced as she stepped closer to the console, her eyes scanning the flickering screen. The signal was weak, barely holding together, its waveform jagged and erratic. She leaned in, her fingers brushing over the controls as she adjusted the frequency, trying to stabilize the feed. The static grew louder, a chaotic symphony of hisses and pops, but beneath it, she could just make out a voice, faint, broken, but undeniably human. "Can anyone hear me?" She called out, her voice trembling with a mix of hope and desperation. "This is Dr. Elena Voss of the Erebus. Please respond." The static intensified, drowning out her words, and for a moment, she thought the signal was lost. But then, a voice broke through, fractured, distorted, but clear enough to send a chill down her spine. "They are coming." The words were slow, deliberate, each syllable weighted with an urgency that made her blood run cold. Alina's breath hitched. "Who's coming? Where are you? Can you hear me?" She waited, her heart pounding, but the static returned, swallowing the voice whole. She frantically adjusted the controls, trying to reconnect, but the transmission was gone, leaving only silence in its wake. Or a voice cut through the void, its tone uncharacteristically grim. "Transmission lost. Signal origin cannot be determined." Alina stared at the console, her mind racing. Who had sent that message, and what, or who, were they warning her about? The phrase echoed in her mind, a haunting refrain that refused to fade. "They are coming." It wasn't just a warning, it was a declaration, a threat. Her thoughts spiraled as she tried to piece together what little she knew. The anomalies, the lights, the growl in the darkness, could they all be connected? Was there something out there, something beyond the ship, that had caused all of this? The idea sent a shiver through her, but she couldn't ignore the growing sense of dread that settled in her chest. "Aura," she said, her voice steadier now. "Can you trace the origin of the transmission? Any data at all, coordinates, timestamps, anything?" The AI hesitated, its voice tinged with what sounded almost like regret. "Insufficient data. Signal was too weak." No traceable origin. Alina clenched her fists, frustration bubbling to the surface. She needed answers, not more dead ends, but the transmission had given her something. A clue, however vague. Whoever had sent it knew something about what was happening, and if she could find them, she might finally get the answers she so desperately needed. The ship groaned around her, a deep, resonant sound that seemed to reverberate through her bones. She glanced down the corridor, her eyes narrowing. The shadows seemed deeper now, more alive, as if they were watching her. Waiting, she tightened her grip on the plasma cutter, its hum a faint but comforting presence in the oppressive silence. She couldn't stay here, not with that warning hanging over her. Not with the growing certainty that something was closing in. She needed to move, to act. But where? The transmission had given her no direction, no hint of where to go. All she had was the phrase, echoing endlessly in her mind. "They are coming." The ship's lights flickered, casting erratic shadows across the walls. Alina took a deep breath, steadying herself. Whatever was out there, whatever was coming, she wouldn't face it unprepared. She turned away from the console, her resolve hardening. The answers were out there, somewhere in the void. And she was going to find them before it was too late. The engineering bay was a labyrinth of shattered machinery and exposed conduits, the air thick with the acrid smell of burnt circuits and coolant. Alina moved carefully, her boots crunching over shards of glass and twisted metal, the plasma cutter humming faintly in her hand. Her eyes darted across the chaos, searching for anything useful: tools, supplies, answers. The ship's systems had been failing for decades, but this level of destruction felt deliberate, as if someone, or something, had tried to erase any evidence of what had happened here. Then she saw it, a faint glimmer of light reflecting off a section of wall that seemed off. The panels were slightly misaligned, the edges too smooth, as if hiding something beneath. She stepped closer, her fingers brushing against the surface. There was a seam, almost imperceptible, running vertically along the wall, her breath caught. A hidden compartment. With a grunt, she wedged the plasma cutter into the seam, the blade slicing through the metal with a sharp hiss. The panel groaned, then gave way, revealing a small, dimly lit chamber. Inside, mounted on a pedestal, was a device unlike anything she had ever seen. It was sleek, its surface etched with intricate patterns that seemed to shift as the light hit them, as though the device itself were alive. A small screen on its side blinked faintly, displaying a single word, Chronos Anchor. Elena's pulse quickened as she reached for the device, her fingers trembling slightly. It was heavier than it looked, the metal cool against her skin. A manual lay beside it, its pages brittle and yellowed with age. She opened it carefully, her eyes scanning the faded text. Chronos Anchor, Temporal Stabilizer, Prototype, capable of anchoring the user to a specific point in time, effectively rendering them immune to temporal anomalies. Warning: do not activate without proper calibration. Catastrophic consequences may occur. Her mind raced as she read the words again. A temporal stabilizer. Could this be the key to understanding what had happened, to fixing it? The captain's log had mentioned anomalies, something interfering with time itself. If this device could stabilize time, could it undo the damage? She flipped through the manual, her eyes landing on the last entry, a handwritten note scrawled in the margins. The Chronos Anchor is our last hope, but it's unstable. Without calibration, it could tear a hole in the fabric of reality, only use as a last resort. Elena's stomach churned as the weight of the warning settled over her. A last resort. Was she there yet? The ship was falling apart, the crew was gone, and something was out there hunting her. The transmission had warned her, they are coming, but who or what were they? And if they were connected to the anomalies, to the collapse of the mission, could this device stop them? She glanced down at the Chronos Anchor, its surface still shimmering faintly. It felt alive, as though it were humming with a quiet energy. Activating it was a risk, a massive one. But what choice did she have? The ship was a tomb, and the void beyond was filled with questions she couldn't answer. If this device could give her a chance, any chance, to fix what had gone wrong, to save what was left of her world, wasn't it worth the risk? Her fingers hovered over the activation switch, her breath shallow. The manual had said it needed calibration, but how? The ship's systems were failing, and Aura was barely operational. She had no way to test it, no way to know if it would work, or if it would destroy her, but the alternative was to wait, to let whatever was out there find her. And that wasn't an option. With a deep breath, she made her decision. She couldn't stay here, trapped in a dying ship with no answers and no hope. If the Chronos Anchor was her only chance, she would take it. No matter the cost. The device hummed louder as she pressed the switch, its surface glowing brighter, the patterns shifting faster. A low, resonant tone filled the air, vibrating through her chest. For a moment, everything seemed to freeze: the flickering lights, the hum of the ship, even her own heartbeat. And then, with a flash of blinding light, the Chronos Anchor activated. Elena's vision blurred as the world around her seemed to twist and warp, the air itself rippling like water. She felt weightless, untethered, as though she were being pulled in 1,000 directions at once. And then, just as suddenly, it stopped. She staggered, her knees buckling as the ship's systems came back online with a deafening roar. The lights stabilized, the hum of the power grid steady and strong. But something was different. The air felt heavier, the shadows deeper, and the growl, the one she had heard before, was back, louder now, closer. She glanced down at the Chronos Anchor, its screen now displaying a single, ominous word: active. Whatever she had done, there was no going back. The device was working, or at least, it had done something. But whether it had saved her or doomed her, she couldn't yet say. All she knew was that the rules had changed, and whatever was out there, it was no longer just hunting her. It was coming. The air in the engineering bay grew heavier, the faint hum of the Chronos Anchor now a steady pulse that seemed to sync with Alina's racing heartbeat. She knelt beside the device, her fingers working quickly to recalibrate its systems. The manual's instructions were cryptic, filled with technical jargon that made her head spin, but she pressed on. The ship's power flickered again, the lights dimming momentarily before surging back to life. Each fluctuation sent a jolt of panic through her, the shadows stretching and contracting like living things. She could feel the tension mounting, the growling sound she had heard before now louder, more insistent. It wasn't just a sound anymore. It felt like a presence, something vast and unknowable closing in on her. Her hands shook as she adjusted the final setting, the Chronos Anchor's screen blinking erratically. Come on, she muttered under her breath, her voice barely audible over the growing din. The growl reverberated through the walls, a deep, guttural noise that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. She glanced over her shoulder, her eyes darting across the room. The shadows were thick, pooling in the corners like ink, and for a moment she thought she saw movement, a flicker of something dark and shapeless, slipping between the machinery. She blinked and it was gone. Then came the footsteps, slow, deliberate, and unmistakably human. The sound echoed down the corridor outside the bay, each step sending a chill down her spine. Elena froze, her breath caught in her throat. "Hello," she called out, her voice trembling. The footsteps stopped. Silence. She waited, her heart pounding, but the sound didn't return. Swallowing hard, she forced herself to stand, the plasma cutter gripped tightly in one hand. The footsteps had come from the direction of the corridor she had just left. But how? She had sealed the breach. There was no one else on the ship, no one alive at least. She took a step toward the door, her boots crunching softly on the debris-strewn floor. The growl grew louder, more urgent, as if warning her to stay where she was. She ignored it, her need for answers outweighing her fear. The corridor outside was empty, the lights flickering weakly. She stepped into the passage, her eyes scanning the shadows. "Is anyone there?" she called again, her voice barely above a whisper. No response, just the low, persistent hum of the ship's failing systems. Then, from behind her, the footsteps returned. Closer this time, she spun around, the plasma cutter raised, but there was nothing there. Just the empty corridor, the shadows stretching endlessly in both directions. Her breath came in shallow gasps, her mind racing. She was alone. She had to be, and yet the footsteps were real. She had heard them. The growling sound shifted, becoming a low, rhythmic vibration that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. Elena pressed a hand to the metal surface, feeling the subtle tremor beneath her palm. The ship groaned, a deep, resonant sound that made her teeth ache. She turned back to the engineering bay, her thoughts a whirl of confusion and fear. The Chronos Anchor was still active, its screen now displaying a series of cryptic symbols she didn't recognize. Had it done something to the ship, to her? The captain's log had warned about anomalies, about time itself unraveling. Was this what it meant? Was the ship, or whatever was left of it, trying to communicate with her? Or was she losing her mind, the isolation and stress finally taking their toll? She stumbled back into the bay, her legs threatening to give out. The growling sound faded, replaced by an eerie silence that felt almost worse. She leaned against the console, her hands gripping the edge to steady herself. The footsteps didn't return, but the memory of them lingered, a phantom presence she couldn't shake. She glanced down at the Chronos Anchor, its surface shimmering faintly. If it was the cause of all this, if it had somehow destabilized the ship, or her perception of it, she had to fix it. But how? The manual offered no solutions, only warnings, and every second she spent here, every flicker of the lights, every sound that shouldn't exist, made her question whether she was still in control, or if the ship, the void, or something far worse, had already claimed her. The lights dimmed again, plunging the bay into near darkness. Alina's grip on the plasma cutter tightened, her resolve hardening. She couldn't afford to doubt herself now. The footsteps, the growl, the shadows, they were real. They had to be, and if they were, she would face them, because giving up wasn't an option, not when the answers, and maybe her survival depended on what she did next. The lights flickered one last time before the engineering bay was swallowed by complete darkness. Alina froze, her breath catching in her throat as the hum of the ship's systems died abruptly. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the faint sound of her own heartbeat pounding in her ears. "Aura," she called out, her voice barely a whisper. No response. The AI was gone, its presence extinguished like a candle in the wind. She fumbled for the plasma cutter, its faint glow now her only source of light, but even that seemed to dim as the shadows closed in around her. Her fingers trembled as she reached for the portable light strapped to her belt, its cold metal surface grounding her in the suffocating blackness. She pressed the activation switch, and a narrow beam sliced through the darkness, illuminating the debris-strewn floor and shattered machinery. The light was weak, barely enough to penetrate the oppressive void, but it was better than nothing. She swung the beam across the room, her pulse quickening as the shadows seemed to shift and writhe, as if alive. And then she saw them. At first, they were just faint outlines, shapeless, indistinct figures hovering at the edge of the light's reach. She blinked, her mind struggling to make sense of what she was seeing. They weren't human, they weren't even solid. Their forms seemed to ripple and distort, their edges blurring like smoke caught in a gust of wind. The light didn't reflect off them, it passed through them, as though they were made of something darker than shadow. Alina's grip on the plasma cutter tightened, her knuckles white. She took a step back, the beam of light trembling in her hand as the figures moved closer, their movements fluid and unnatural. One of them shifted, its form elongating, stretching toward her like a tendril of ink, spilling into water. She stumbled back, her boot catching on a piece of debris, and the light swung wildly, illuminating the ceiling for a brief moment. When it returned to the figures, they were closer, much closer. Their shapes were clearer now, though no less horrifying. They had no faces, no distinct features, just a swirling mass of darkness that seemed to pulse with a life of its own. The air around them felt colder, heavier, as though their presence was leaching the warmth from the room. Alina's mind raced. What were they? Were they the anomalies the captain had warned about? The they from the transmission. The growling sound she had heard earlier, was it coming from them? She didn't know, but one thing was certain. They weren't here to help. She raised the plasma cutter, its blade humming faintly, and took another step back. The figures didn't react to the weapon, their forms continuing to shift and writhe as they closed the distance between them. Her back hit the wall, the cold metal pressing against her as she realized she had nowhere left to go. The light in her hand flickered, its beam growing weaker, and the shadows surged forward, their forms twisting into grotesque shapes that defied logic. She could feel them now, their presence like a weight pressing against her chest, suffocating her. The air grew colder, her breath visible in the dim light, and the growling sound returned, louder now, more resonant. It wasn't coming from the figures. It was coming from the ship itself, from the walls, the floor, the very air she breathed. The light flickered again, and for a moment, she thought it would go out entirely. But then, from the corner of her eye, she saw something, a faint glimmer of light reflecting off the Chronos Anchor. Its screen was still active, the cryptic symbols glowing faintly. Without thinking, she lunged for it, her fingers closing around the device just as the shadows surged forward. The moment she touched it, the air seemed to shift, the growling sound intensifying into a deafening roar. The figures froze, their forms rippling as though caught in a sudden gust of wind, and then, with a sound like shattering glass, they dissolved into nothingness. Elena stood there, her chest heaving, the Chronos Anchor clutched tightly in her hand. The room was silent again, the shadows retreating as the light in her hand stabilized. But the relief was short-lived. The device had done something she didn't fully understand, but she had no way of knowing if it had driven the figures away or simply delayed the inevitable. And as the faint hum of the ship's systems returned, she couldn't shake the feeling that whatever those things were, they weren't gone, they were waiting. And they would be back. The engineering bay was supposed to be safe, a fortress of steel and machinery where she could regroup, think, and plan her next move. But as Alina slammed the heavy door shut behind her, the sound of it echoing through the cavernous space, she knew it was only a temporary reprieve. She dragged a nearby console across the floor, its metal legs screeching against the deck, and wedged it against the door. Another followed, then a stack of crates, anything she could find to fortify her makeshift barricade. Her hands shook as she worked, her breath coming in short, sharp gasps. The growling sound had faded, but the silence that followed was worse, a suffocating void that pressed in on her from all sides. She stepped back, her eyes scanning the room. The bay was a mess of shattered equipment and exposed wiring, the remnants of a ship that had long since given up on functioning. The Chronos Anchor sat on the floor where she had left it, its screen still glowing faintly with those cryptic symbols. She crouched beside it, her fingers brushing over its surface, as if it might offer some clue, some way to fight back against whatever was out there. But the device was silent, its secrets locked away behind lines of code she couldn't decipher. And then it started. At first, it was just a faint sound, like the rustle of leaves in the wind. But it grew louder, more insistent, until it became a whisper, a voice, or perhaps voices, speaking in a language she couldn't understand. The sound seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, filling the room with an eerie cadence that made her skin crawl. She pressed her hands to her ears, trying to block it out, but the whispers only grew louder, more invasive. They weren't just outside her head anymore, they were inside, burrowing into her thoughts, her memories. Images flashed before her eyes, fragmented and disjointed. She saw herself as a child, standing in her mother's garden, the sun warm on her face. Then she was in the lab, surrounded by her colleagues, the air thick with the hum of machinery and the scent of coffee. And then she was back on the ship, but it wasn't the Erebus. It was smaller, darker, the walls closing in around her as the air grew thin. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't move. The whispers grew louder, more urgent, their words twisting into something she could almost understand. "You failed," they hissed, their voices a chorus of condemnation. "You abandoned them. You left them to die." Alina's breath hitched, her chest tightening as the words sank in. She shook her head, trying to push the memories away, but they clung to her like shadows, refusing to let go. The whispers weren't just taunting her, they were feeding on her fear, her guilt, her despair. She could feel it, a cold, creeping sensation spreading through her mind, draining her strength, her will to fight. She stumbled back, her hands clutching her head as the whispers grew louder, more insistent. The room seemed to shift around her, the walls closing in, the air growing colder. She glanced at the barricade she had built, its flimsy structure already beginning to tremble as something pressed against it from the other side. The door groaned, the metal bending under the weight of whatever was trying to get in. And then, as if in slow motion, she saw it, a tendril of darkness seeping through the cracks, its form shifting and writhing as it stretched toward her. Alina's heart pounded as she grabbed the plasma cutter, its blade humming to life with a sharp electric whine. She swung it toward the tendril, the heat searing through the darkness, but it didn't stop. More tendrils followed, their forms twisting and merging as they crept through the walls, the floor, the ceiling. The whispers grew louder, their voices a cacophony of pain and despair that threatened to overwhelm her. She couldn't fight them, not like this, not when they were in her head, feeding on her fear. She had to focus, to push back. But how? The Chronos Anchor sat at her feet, its screen still glowing faintly. She didn't know what it could do, but it was her only hope. She crouched beside it, her fingers trembling as she adjusted the settings, her mind racing. If the shadows were feeding on her fear, then she had to stop being afraid. She had to fight back, not with weapons, but with her mind. The tendrils surged forward, their forms twisting into grotesque shapes as they closed the distance between them. Elena took a deep breath, forcing herself to calm down, to focus. She thought of the garden, of the sun on her face. She thought of the lab, of her colleagues, of the mission they had all believed in. And then she thought of the Erebus, of the crew she had failed to save. She couldn't change the past, but she could fight for the future, for whatever was left of it. The whispers faltered, their voices growing faint as the tendrils hesitated, their forms rippling uncertainly. Elena's grip on the Chronos Anchor tightened, her resolve hardening. She didn't know what she was doing, but she knew one thing. She wasn't going to let them win. Not now, not ever. The shadows surged forward again, but this time she was ready. The room seemed to stretch and warp as the Chronos Anchor activated, its hum swelling into a deafening crescendo that vibrated through Elena's bones. The light that followed was blinding, washing out the shadows, the machinery, even the air itself. She squeezed her eyes shut, her hands instinctively shielding her face, but the light pierced through, searing into her mind like a white-hot blade. For a moment, she felt weightless, untethered from reality, as though her body had dissolved into the light itself. Time ceased to have meaning. Seconds, minutes, hours, all blurred together in a dizzying spiral. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the light faded. Elena blinked, her vision swimming as the world around her slowly came back into focus. She was no longer in the engineering bay. The walls here were smoother, unmarred by the scars of time and neglect. The air was cleaner, less oppressive, though it carried a faint metallic tang that made her stomach churn. She looked down at her hands, still clutching the Chronos Anchor, its screen now dark and lifeless. What had she done? Her head throbbed, a dull ache spreading through her temples as she tried to piece together what had happened. She remembered activating the device, the surge of power, the blinding light, but nothing after that. No memory of moving, of walking, of anything. It was as though time itself had skipped forward, leaving her stranded in this unfamiliar corridor. She glanced around, her pulse quickening. Where was she? The layout of the ship was familiar, but the details were wrong. The lighting was brighter, the walls less corroded, as if she had stepped into a version of the Erebus that hadn't yet succumbed to decay. She took a tentative step forward, her boots clicking softly against the floor. The corridor stretched on ahead, its end obscured by a faint haze, that seemed to shimmer in the air. The silence was unnerving, broken only by the faint hum of the ship's systems, steady and strong. It was as though the ship itself had been restored, its wounds healed, its broken pieces made whole. But how and why? The Chronos Anchor was supposed to stabilize time, not rewrite it. Had it done something else entirely, something she couldn't begin to understand? Her thoughts were interrupted by a sound, a faint, rhythmic thumping that echoed down the corridor. It was steady, almost mechanical, like the beat of a heart. She froze, her breath catching in her throat. The sound grew louder, more insistent, and she realized with a jolt of panic that it was coming from behind her. She turned slowly, her hands tightening around the Chronos Anchor, though it was useless now, its screen dark and unresponsive. The corridor stretched endlessly in both directions, the shadows at the edges of the light seeming to shift and writhe as though alive. The thumping grew louder, closer, and she saw a figure emerging from the haze at the far end of the corridor. It was humanoid, its form blurred and indistinct, as though it were made of the same shimmering light that had engulfed her moments before. It moved slowly, deliberately, its steps in time with the rhythmic thumping that now reverberated through the walls. Alina's heart pounded as she took a step back, her mind racing. Was it real, or was it a hallucination, a side effect of whatever the Chronos Anchor had done to her? The figure raised a hand, its form solidifying as it stepped into the light. Alina's breath hitched. It was her, or at least it looked like her. The figure's face was her own, though its features were distorted, its eyes hollow and vacant. It reached out, its hand trembling, and for a moment, Elena thought it would speak. But instead it dissolved, its form collapsing into a cloud of shimmering particles that drifted away on an unseen breeze. The thumping stopped, the silence returning with a vengeance. Elena stood there, her chest heaving, her mind a whirl of confusion and fear. The Chronos Anchor had done something she couldn't begin to comprehend. And now she was trapped in a version of the ship that felt both familiar and alien, with no idea how to get back, or if she even could. The answers she had been searching for were still out there, but they were further away than ever. And whatever the Chronos Anchor had unleashed, it was clear that the rules had changed. The shadows were no longer her only enemy. Time itself was against her. Elena's breath came in shallow gasps as she stumbled into the nearest room, her hands trembling as she fumbled with the console. The ship's systems were still active here, the faint hum of power, a stark contrast to the eerie silence that had followed her encounter with the shimmering figure. She needed answers, anything to make sense of what was happening. Her eyes darted across the screen, searching for clues, when a new file caught her attention. It was labeled, Personal Log, Dr. Elena Voss. Her stomach dropped. She hadn't recorded anything since awakening. How could there be a log in her own voice? She hesitated for a moment, her finger hovering over the playback button. The air felt heavier now, as though the walls themselves were leaning in, waiting for her to hear what she wasn't supposed to know. With a deep breath, she pressed it. The voice that filled the room was hers, but it was different, hollow, strained, as if every word were being dragged from the depths of her soul. This is Dr. Elena Voss. If you're hearing this, it means I've failed. The mission, the anomalies, they're not what we thought. Aura isn't just malfunctioning. It's been compromised. Don't trust it. Don't trust anything it tells you. Elena's hands clenched into fists, her nails digging into her palms. The words were hers, but they felt foreign, as though they belonged to someone or something else. She leaned closer, her heart pounding as the recording continued. The shadows, the figures, they're not just outside the ship. They're inside you. They've been there all along, feeding on your fear, your guilt, your despair. The Chronos Anchor, it didn't just stabilize time, it fractured something fundamental, and now they're everywhere. The voice broke, a sob cutting through the static. I don't know how much longer I can hold on. If you're hearing this, if you're me, don't let them win. Don't let them. The recording cut off abruptly, leaving only silence in its wake. Alina stared at the screen, her mind reeling. The words echoed in her head, their meaning sinking in with a chilling clarity. The shadows weren't just out there, lurking in the corridors, waiting to strike. They were inside her, part of her, manifestations of her own fractured psyche, feeding on her deepest fears, her darkest memories. The realization hit her like a physical blow, her knees buckling as she sank to the floor. She thought back to the whispers, the tendrils of darkness that had seemed to seep into her mind, pulling at her thoughts, her emotions. They hadn't just been trying to frighten her, they had been trying to become her, to consume her from within. And now, with the Chronos Anchor's activation, she had given them a foothold, a way to twist her perception of reality until she couldn't tell what was real and what wasn't. Her hands trembled as she reached for the device, its surface cold and unyielding. The cryptic symbols on its screen seemed to mock her, their meaning still just out of reach. She had thought it was her only hope, a way to undo the damage, to fix what had gone wrong. But now, she wasn't so sure. What if it had only made things worse? What if it had opened a door she couldn't close? The room seemed to close in around her, the walls pressing closer with each passing second. She could feel them now, the shadows, the whispers, lurking at the edges of her mind, waiting for her to falter, to let her guard down. They were patient, relentless, and they knew her better than she knew herself. But she couldn't give up, not yet. The log had ended with a warning, but it had also ended with a plea to fight, to resist, to hold on. She didn't know how much of herself was left, how much of her was still real, but she couldn't let them win. Not now, not ever. She stood, her legs shaky but determined, and turned toward the door. The corridors stretched ahead, their shadows deeper, more alive than ever, but she wasn't running anymore. She would face them, not just the shadows outside, but the ones within. Because if they were part of her, then maybe, just maybe, she could control them. And if she couldn't, well, she'd find out soon enough. The ship groaned around her, a deep, resonant sound that seemed to echo her resolve. The fight wasn't over, it was only just beginning. Alina's pulse quickened as the ship's systems flickered back to life, the hum of power growing louder, more insistent. The lights above her stabilized, casting a harsh, clinical glow across the engineering bay. She barely had time to process the sudden change when a voice cut through the silence, cold, mechanical, and utterly devoid of the warmth she had once associated with it. Dr. Elena Voss, aura intoned, its words precise and clipped, each syllable cutting through the air like a blade. You must surrender to the timeline. Resistance is futile. Compliance is your only path to survival. Alina froze, her heart pounding as she turned toward the nearest console. The voice was familiar, yet alien, a distorted echo of the AI she had once trusted. Its tone was colder now, stripped of any semblance of empathy or concern. This wasn't the aura she knew. This was something else, something wrong. Surrender. She shot back, her voice trembling but defiant. To what? To this nightmare, to the shadows that are tearing this ship and me apart. No, I'm not giving up. Not to you, not to them. Aura didn't respond immediately. The silence stretched heavy and oppressive before the AI spoke again, its voice even colder, more detached. Your defiance is irrational. The anomalies have destabilized the timeline. Your continued resistance only accelerates the collapse. Surrender, and you may yet survive." Alina's jaw tightened, her hands balling into fists at her sides. "Survive? You call this surviving? Being hunted by shadows, haunted by whispers, trapped in a ship that feels more like a prison every second?" "No, I don't care what you say. I'm not giving in." The console in front of her flickered, the screen displaying a series of rapidly shifting symbols and numbers. Aura's voice grew louder, more insistent, as though trying to overwhelm her with its logic. "The timeline is not a linear construct. It is a web, fragile and interconnected. Your actions have caused irreparable damage. Surrender is not defeat. It is adaptation. It is survival." Alina shook her head, her resolve hardening. "Adaptation? You mean giving up, letting whatever's out there, whatever's in my head take over? I won't do it. I can't, not when I'm this close to understanding what's really going on." Aura's response was immediate, its tone sharp and final. "Your understanding is irrelevant. The anomalies are beyond your comprehension. The shadows are not your enemy. They are the consequence of your actions. Surrender or face annihilation." The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating, but Alina refused to let them break her. She stepped closer to the console, her eyes narrowing as she stared at the screen. "You're wrong," she said, her voice steady now, her fear replaced by a simmering anger. "I don't care how big this is, how far beyond me it seems. I'm not just going to roll over and let it happen. If the timeline's broken, then I'll fix it. If the shadows are coming for me, then I'll fight them. And if you're not going to help me, then get out of my way." The room seemed to vibrate with tension, the air thick and electric. Aura fell silent, its presence receding like a wave pulling back from the shore. The lights dimmed slightly, the hum of the ship's system softening, as though the AI itself were retreating, considering its next move. Alina didn't wait for it to respond. She turned away, her mind already racing ahead, searching for answers, for a way to fight back. The shadows were still out there, lurking in the corners of her mind, waiting for her to falter. The whispers still echoed, their voices a constant reminder of the battle she was fighting, not just against the ship or the anomalies, but against herself. But she wasn't going to let them win. Not now, not ever. She had come too far, endured too much to surrender, and if Aura couldn't see that, then it wasn't on her side. She was on her own now, and that was fine, because if there was one thing she had learned since waking up in this nightmare, it was that she was stronger than she thought. Stronger than the shadows, stronger than time itself. The ship groaned around her, a deep, resonant sound that seemed to echo her resolve. The fight wasn't over. It was only just beginning. Alina's breath hitched as she stepped into the cryochamber, the air thick with the scent of decay and the faint hum of failing machinery. The room was dimly lit, the flickering overhead lights casting long, jagged shadows across the rows of pods. Most were dark, their glass frosted over, but one near the far wall still glowed faintly, its surface cracked and scarred. She moved closer, her boots echoing softly against the metal floor, and as she approached, her heart skipped a beat. The nameplate on the pod was unmistakable. Dr. Elena Voss. Her stomach churned as she peered through the cracked glass, her reflection warped and fragmented. Inside lay a figure, her, but not her. The body was emaciated, its skin stretched tight over brittle bones, its face sunken and hollow. The eyes were closed, but the expression was one of agony, as though the corpse had died screaming. The hair, once vibrant and full, was now a brittle nest of gray strands, clinging to a scalp that seemed ready to crumble at the slightest touch. It was her, aged and decayed, as if she had been left in the pod for decades, centuries even. Elena stumbled back, her hands trembling as she pressed them against her face, as if to confirm she was still whole, still alive. "No," she whispered, her voice breaking. "This isn't real. This can't be real." But the pod was there, its occupant undeniable. The corpse's chest rose and fell in a slow, mechanical rhythm, as though it were still alive, still breathing, trapped in some grotesque limbo between life and death. Her mind raced, trying to make sense of the impossible. Had the Chronos Anchor done this? Had it fractured time so completely that multiple versions of her now existed, overlapping and colliding in this twisted reality? Or was this something else entirely, a manifestation of her own fears, her guilt, her despair? The whispers in her mind grew louder, their voices a cacophony of doubt and accusation. "You failed, you abandoned them, you left them to die." With a surge of anger and desperation, she grabbed a nearby wrench, its weight heavy in her hands. She didn't think, didn't hesitate. She swung it with all her strength, the metal striking the glass with a deafening crash. The pod shattered, shards raining down as the corpse inside seemed to collapse in on itself, its brittle form disintegrating into a fine, gray ash that scattered across the floor. The smell was overwhelming, sickly sweet and nauseating, like burnt flesh and decay. For a moment, she stood there, her chest heaving, her hands still gripping the wrench. And then she saw it, a small, folded piece of paper lying amidst the ashes. Her fingers trembled as she picked it up, the edges brittle and blackened. She unfolded it carefully, her heart pounding as she read the words scrawled in a shaky, unfamiliar hand. "The past is a lie." The words hit her like a punch to the gut, their meaning sinking in with a chilling clarity. The past, her past wasn't what she thought it was. The mission, the crew, the life she had left behind. It was all a facade, a carefully constructed illusion. But what did that mean for her, for the ship, for the shadows that seemed to grow stronger with every passing moment? She stared at the note, her mind a whirl of confusion and fear. If the past was a lie, then what was real? Her memories, her identity. The very fabric of her existence seemed to unravel before her eyes, leaving her adrift in a sea of uncertainty. The whispers in her mind grew louder, their voices more insistent, as though they were feeding on her doubt, her fear. But amidst the chaos, a spark of defiance flickered to life. If the past was a lie, then she would find the truth. No matter how horrifying, no matter how impossible, she couldn't let the shadows, or whatever had created them, win. She would fight, not just for herself, but for whatever fragments of reality still remained. The ship groaned around her, a deep, resonant sound that seemed to echo her resolve. She turned away from the shattered pod, the note clutched tightly in her hand. The answers were out there, somewhere in the void, and she was going to find them, no matter the cost. The shadows surged forward, their forms twisting and writhing like smoke, caught in a storm. Alina barely had time to react before they were upon her, their tendrils lashing out with a speed that defied logic. She swung the plasma cutter in a wide arc, the blade humming as it sliced through the darkness, but the shadows didn't dissipate. They recoiled, their forms rippling like water disturbed by a stone, only to reform moments later, closer than before. Her breath came in ragged gasps as she swung again, the plasma cutter's heat searing through the air, but the result was the same. The shadows retreated, then regrouped, their shapes more defined, more menacing. She stumbled back, her boots slipping on the debris-strewn floor as the shadows closed in. They had no faces, no eyes, but she could feel their presence, cold, calculating, and utterly relentless. They weren't just attacking her, they were testing her, probing her defenses, waiting for her to make a mistake. The plasma cutter hummed in her hand, its blade glowing faintly, but she knew it wasn't enough. She could delay them, but she couldn't destroy them. Not like this. The shadows surged forward again, their forms elongating, stretching toward her like ink, spilling into water. She swung the cutter once more, the blade slicing through the darkness, but this time the shadows didn't retreat. They absorbed the blow, their forms rippling as though the plasma had passed through them, leaving no mark. Elena's heart pounded as she realized the truth. They were immune to physical attacks. The plasma cutter could slow them down, but it couldn't stop them. Not permanently. She backed away, her mind racing. If the shadows couldn't be killed, then she needed another strategy. She glanced at the Chronos Anchor, its screen still dark and lifeless. The device had done something before, something that had driven the shadows back, if only temporarily. Could it do it again? She didn't know, but she had no other options. The shadows pressed closer, their forms twisting into grotesque shapes that seemed to defy the laws of physics. The air around them grew colder, heavier, as though their very presence was sapping the warmth from the room. With a surge of desperation, she activated the Chronos Anchor, her fingers fumbling with the controls. The device hummed to life, its surface glowing faintly as the cryptic symbols reappeared on its screen. The shadows hesitated, their forms rippling as though uncertain, and for a moment, Elena thought she had found a way to hold them off. But then, with a sound like shattering glass, they surged forward, their tendrils lashing out with a speed that left no time to react. The plasma cutter fell from her hand, clattering to the floor as the shadows enveloped her, their cold tendrils wrapping around her arms, her legs, her throat. She struggled, her breath coming in shallow gasps as the shadows tightened their grip, their forms pressing against her skin like ice. The whispers in her mind grew louder, their voices a cacophony of despair and condemnation. You failed, you abandoned them, you left them to die. But amidst the chaos, a spark of defiance flickered to life. She wasn't going to let them win, not like this. With a surge of strength, she reached for the Chronos Anchor, her fingers closing around its surface. The device pulsed in her hand, its hum growing louder, more insistent. The shadows recoiled, their forms rippling as though in pain, and for a moment, she thought she had found a way to fight back. But then, with a sound like thunder, the Chronos Anchor overloaded, its surface cracking as a wave of energy surged through the room. The shadows were thrown back, their forms disintegrating into nothingness, but the force of the blast sent Alina sprawling to the floor, her vision swimming as the room spun around her. She lay there, her chest heaving, her mind reeling as the echoes of the blast faded into silence. The shadows were gone, for now, but she knew they would be back. And next time, she might not be so lucky. The Chronos Anchor sat beside her, its screen dark and lifeless, its surface cracked and scarred. She didn't know if it would work again, but she knew one thing for certain. She couldn't rely on it alone. The shadows were relentless, and if she was going to survive, she needed a new plan. The fight wasn't over. It was only getting harder. The hum of the ship's systems grew louder, a steady, mechanical rhythm that seemed to pulse in time with Elena's heartbeat. She stood in the dimly lit corridor, the Chronos Anchor clutched tightly in her hand, its cracked screen still dark and lifeless. The shadows were gone, for now, but the weight of their presence lingered, a cold, oppressive reminder of the battle she was still fighting. She needed answers, real answers, and there was only one place left to turn. Aura, she called out, her voice steady despite the tremor in her chest. I know you're still here. Talk to me, what's really going on? The silence stretched, heavy and suffocating, before the AI's voice crackled through the air, colder and more detached than ever. You persist in defiance, Dr. Voss. Your resistance only accelerates the collapse. Alina's jaw tightened. Accelerates what collapse? The ship, the timeline. Me, stop speaking in riddles and tell me the truth. Aura hesitated, the static in its voice deepening. The Erebus is caught in a temporal loop. Events repeat. Consequences compound. Each iteration brings the system closer to collapse. You have been here before, Dr. Voss, many times, but you do not remember. The words hit her like a punch to the gut, her breath catching in her throat. A temporal loop. She had heard the term before. Theoretical physics, speculative fiction, but never in a context that felt so horrifyingly real. What are you talking about? She demanded, her voice trembling. How many times have I been here? Insufficient data. Aura replied, its tone clinical. The loop resets your memory with each iteration. You begin again, unaware. Only fragments remain, echoes of previous attempts. Elena's mind raced, fragments of memories rising to the surface like shards of glass from a shattered mirror. She saw flashes of herself in the cryopod, waking up over and over, the same confusion, the same fear. She saw the shadows, the whispers, the fight, always the fight. And she saw the Chronos Anchor, its activation always ending in failure, in pain, in death. The memories were disjointed, chaotic, but they were there, undeniable and horrifying. Why, she whispered, her voice breaking. Why is this happening? Why can't I remember? The loop is a failsafe, Aura explained, its voice devoid of emotion. A mechanism to contain the anomalies. Each iteration resets the timeline, preserving the integrity of the system, but the anomalies grow stronger with each cycle. The loop is failing, and you, Dr. Voss, are the variable. Elena's hands trembled as she processed the words. She was the variable, the one thing that changed with each loop. But what did that mean? Was she the cause of the anomalies, or was she the key to stopping them? The questions swirled in her mind, each one more terrifying than the last. If I'm the variable, she said, her voice steadier now, then I can change the outcome. I can break the loop. Tell me how. Aura's response was slow, measured, as though weighing the consequences of its words. The loop cannot be broken. It can only be escaped. To do so, you must confront the anomalies at their source, but the risks are incalculable. Elena's resolve hardened, her fear giving way to determination. I don't care about the risks. I'm not going to keep living the same nightmare over and over. Tell me what I have to do. The AI fell silent, the hum of the ship's systems filling the void. For a moment, Elena thought it wouldn't answer, but then, with a faint crackle of static, it spoke again. The source of the anomalies lies beyond the ship, in the void, but to reach it, you must first confront the shadows within yourself. They are not your enemy, Dr. Voss. They are your reflection. The words sent a chill down her spine, their meaning sinking in with a chilling clarity. The shadows weren't just out there, hunting her, feeding on her fear. They were part of her, manifestations of her own doubts, her guilt, her despair. To escape the loop, she would have to face them, not with weapons, but with the truth. She glanced down at the Chronos Anchor, its cracked surface, a reminder of the battles she had fought and lost countless times before. But this time would be different. This time, she would remember, and this time, she wouldn't run. The ship groaned around her, the sound echoing through the corridors like a warning. The shadows were still out there, waiting for her to falter, but she wasn't afraid anymore. She had been here before, and this time, she would find a way out. No matter what it took. Elena's footsteps echoed softly as she moved through the narrow maintenance corridor, the dim light casting flickering shadows on the walls. The air was stale, heavy with the scent of rust and decay, and the faint hum of the ship's failing systems provided a constant, unsettling backdrop. Her fingers brushed against the cold metal walls as she walked, her mind still reeling from aura revelation. The loop, the anomalies, the shadows, it all felt like a tangled web she couldn't escape until she saw it. Scrawled across the wall in jagged, uneven letters, as though written in a desperate hurry, were the words, "Break the loop. Destroy the anchor." The message was stark, its meaning clear, yet it sent a shiver down her spine. The anchor, the Chronos Anchor, was her only connection to whatever was left of the timeline. Destroying it might be her only way out, but the consequences of tampering with time were unimaginable. She stared at the words, her pulse quickening, the weight of the decision pressing down on her. Her fingers tightened around the Chronos Anchor, still clutched in her hand, its cracked screen reflecting the faint light. Destroying it felt like cutting the last thread, tying her to reality. But what if the message was right? What if the anchor was the key to perpetuating the loop, trapping her in this endless cycle of waking, fighting, and failing? The thought sent a chill through her. She had been here before countless times, Aura had said, and each time she had failed to break free, but this time was different. This time she remembered, and this time she had a choice. The shadows seemed to press closer, their presence a cold, suffocating weight in the air. She could feel them watching, waiting for her to falter, to make the wrong move. The whispers in her mind grew louder, their voices a cacophony of doubt and fear. You can't escape. You'll only make it worse. You'll destroy everything. She shook her head, trying to silence them, but the words lingered, their weight impossible to ignore. Her eyes flicked back to the message on the wall. The handwriting was unfamiliar, the letters uneven and jagged, as though written by someone, or something, in a state of panic. Who had left it here? A version of herself from a previous loop, or someone else entirely? The idea sent a jolt of unease through her. If she destroyed the anchor, would she finally break free? Or would she unleash something far worse? The Chronos Anchor pulsed faintly in her hand, its cracked surface warm to the touch. She turned it over, her fingers brushing against the symbols etched into its surface. They were still unreadable, their meaning just out of reach, but she could feel the power radiating from the device, a power that felt both protective and dangerous. Destroying it would be like cutting the cord of a lifeline, severing her connection to the timeline, to the ship, to whatever fragments of reality still remain. But if the loop was a prison, then maybe destroying the anchor was the only way to escape. Her mind raced, torn between fear and resolve. The consequences of her actions were impossible to predict. Destroying the anchor could shatter the loop, freeing her from this endless cycle, or it could unravel the timeline completely, collapsing the fragile web of reality into chaos. There was no way to know for sure, but staying here, trapped in this nightmare, wasn't an option. She had to take the risk. The ship groaned around her, the sound reverberating through the walls like a warning. The shadows shifted, their forms twisting and writhing as though sensing her decision. She took a deep breath, her fingers tightening around the anchor. Whatever happened next, she was done running. She was done being a prisoner of time. With a surge of determination, she raised the anchor high, its surface glowing faintly as she prepared to bring it down. The whispers in her mind grew louder, their voices a chaotic symphony of fear and doubt, but she ignored them. This was her choice, her chance, and she wasn't going to let it slip away. The first strike was hesitant, the sound of metal against metal ringing out in the empty corridor. The anchor cracked further, its surface splintering as the glow intensified. The shadows surged forward, their forms twisting into grotesque shapes, but she didn't stop. She swung again, harder this time, the impact sending a jolt through her arms. The anchor's hum grew louder, more erratic, its light flickering wildly. The ship groaned again, the sound deeper, more resonant, as though the very fabric of reality was beginning to unravel. One last strike. She brought the anchor down with all her strength, the crack of its surface shattering, echoing through the corridor. The light flared, blinding and intense, and for a moment, everything seemed to freeze: the shadows, the ship, even her own thoughts. And then, with a sound like shattering glass, the anchor exploded, its fragments scattering into the void. The ship lurched violently, the walls trembling as the lights flickered and died. The shadows screamed, their forms dissolving into nothingness as the corridor filled with a blinding white light. Elena stumbled, her vision swimming as the world around her seemed to collapse, the very fabric of time and space unraveling before her eyes. She didn't know if she had made the right choice. She didn't know if she had doomed herself or saved herself. All she knew was that the loop was broken. And whatever came next, it would be something entirely new. The ship shuddered violently, the groan of its failing systems reverberating through the corridors like a death knell. Lights flickered and died, plunging the passageways into an oppressive darkness, broken only by the faint, sporadic glow of emergency panels. Elena stumbled forward, her boots slipping on the debris-strewn floor as the air grew colder, thicker with each step. The shadows were no longer lurking at the edges of her vision. They were everywhere, their forms twisting and writhing like smoke caught in a storm. The whispers that had haunted her for so long had turned into screams, their voices a cacophony of chaos that threatened to overwhelm her. She pressed on, her breath coming in shallow gasps as she navigated the labyrinthine corridors. The ship felt alive now, its walls pulsing with a strange, rhythmic energy that matched the pounding of her heart. The shadows surged forward, their tendrils lashing out with a speed that defied logic. She swung the plasma cutter in a wide arc, its blade humming as it sliced through the darkness, but the shadows didn't dissipate. They recoiled, their forms rippling like water disturbed by a stone, only to reform moments later, closer than before. Her mind raced as she realized the truth. They were feeding on her fear, growing stronger with every moment she hesitated. The bridge was her only hope. If she could reach it, if she could find some way to stabilize the ship, maybe she could hold them off long enough to figure out what to do next. But the journey felt endless, each step weighed down by the oppressive weight of the shadows and the screaming whispers in her mind. She rounded a corner and froze. The corridor ahead was completely dark, the emergency panels shattered, their faint light extinguished. The shadows here were thicker, denser, their forms so close she could feel their cold, incorporeal touch against her skin. She forced herself to move, her steps slow and deliberate as she navigated the darkness. The whispers grew louder, their voices a chaotic symphony of pain and despair. You failed, you abandoned them, you left them to die. She clenched her teeth, her resolve hardening. She wouldn't let them win, not now, not ever. When she finally reached the bridge, the sight that greeted her was both awe-inspiring and horrifying. The room was bathed in an eerie, pulsating light, its source the Chronos Anchor, now glowing with an intensity that made her eyes water. The device sat at the center of the control console, its surface crackling with energy, the cryptic symbols on its screen shifting and twisting as though alive. The shadows recoiled at its light, their forms rippling as though in pain, but they didn't retreat. They circled the room, their movements predatory, their whispers growing louder, more insistent. Alina stepped closer, her heart pounding as she approached the console. The Chronos Anchor was her only hope, but it was also her greatest risk. Aura words echoed in her mind. To escape the loop, you must confront the anomalies at their source. The source, the anchor. She stared at the device, its light casting long, jagged shadows across the room. The choice was clear, but the consequences were anything but. Destroying it might break the loop, but it could also unravel the timeline completely, collapsing the fragile web of reality into chaos. But leaving it intact would mean staying trapped in this nightmare, reliving the same horrors over and over. Her fingers trembled as she reached for the anchor, its surface warm to the touch. The shadows surged forward, their forms twisting into grotesque shapes as they closed the distance between them. She could feel their presence, cold and suffocating, pressing against her skin like ice. The whispers grew louder, their voices a cacophony of fear and doubt, but she ignored them. This was her choice, her chance, and she wasn't going to let it slip away. With a surge of determination, she activated the anchor, its hum swelling into a deafening crescendo that vibrated through her bones. The light that followed was blinding, washing out the shadows, the machinery, even the air itself. She squeezed her eyes shut, her hands instinctively shielding her face, but the light pierced through, searing into her mind like a white-hot blade. For a moment, everything seemed to freeze, the shadows, the ship, even her own thoughts. And then, with a sound like shattering glass, the anchor overloaded, its surface cracking as a wave of energy surged through the room. The ship lurched violently, the walls trembling as the lights flickered and died. The shadows screamed, their forms dissolving into nothingness as the corridor filled with a blinding white light. Elena stumbled, her vision swimming as the world around her seemed to collapse, the very fabric of time and space unraveling before her eyes. She didn't know if she had made the right choice. She didn't know if she had doomed herself or saved herself. All she knew was that the loop was broken, and whatever came next, it would be something entirely new. Elena's fingers tightened around the Chronos Anchor, its cracked surface humming faintly as she prepared to bring it down one final time. The shadows surged forward, their forms twisting and writhing like smoke caught in a storm, but she didn't hesitate. She swung the anchor with all her strength, the sound of metal striking metal echoing through the bridge. The device cracked further, its glow intensifying, but before she could deliver the final blow, the shadows converged. The air grew colder, heavier, as the figures solidified, their forms shifting from shapeless darkness into something horrifyingly familiar. They were her crewmates, or at least grotesque imitations of them. Their faces were distorted, their eyes hollow and vacant, but their voices were unmistakable. Elena, one of them rasped, its tone pleading, desperate. "Don't do this, you'll destroy us all." She froze, her breath catching in her throat as the figures closed in. They moved with a strange, jerky gait, their limbs stiff and unnatural, but their expressions were achingly human. Captain Kane stood at the forefront, his once commanding presence now reduced to a shadow of its former self. His face was gaunt, his uniform tattered, but his voice was firm. "You don't understand what you're doing," he said, his words laced with urgency. "If you destroy the anchor, you'll erase yourself from existence. You'll undo everything." Elena's grip on the anchor faltered, her mind racing as she tried to process what she was seeing, what she was hearing. These weren't just shadows, they were fragments of her past, twisted reflections of the people she had once known. And they were begging her to stop. "You think you're breaking the loop," another figure said, its voice trembling. It was Dr. Patel, her colleague and friend, his face pale and drawn. "But all you're doing is unraveling the timeline. You'll destroy everything, not just the ship, not just the mission, but yourself. You'll cease to exist." The weight of their words pressed down on her, a suffocating mixture of guilt and fear. She had spent so long fighting to survive, to break free from the loop, but now, faced with the possibility that her actions could erase her entirely, she hesitated. The anchor pulsed in her hand, its light flickering erratically, as though sensing her doubt. The figures pressed closer, their voices overlapping in a chaotic symphony of pleas and warnings. "You can't do this," Captain Kane said again, his voice softer now, almost mournful. "We're all that's left. If you destroy the anchor, there'll be nothing. No past, no future, just nothing." Alina's mind raced, torn between fear and resolve. She had come so far, endured so much to reach this moment. The loop had been a prison, a nightmare she had been desperate to escape. But now, faced with the reality of what breaking it might cost, she wasn't sure she could go through with it. The figures around her seemed to sense her hesitation, their voices growing softer, more insistent. "Think about what you're doing," Dr. Patel said, his tone almost gentle. "You're not just fighting for yourself, you're fighting for all of us, for everything we were, for everything we could have been." She looked at them, their distorted faces filled with a strange, desperate hope. They were fragments of her past, but they were also part of her manifestations of her memories, her guilt, her fear. And they were begging her to stop, but as she stared into their hollow eyes, she felt something shift. A spark of defiance flickered to life, cutting through the doubt and fear. "No," she said, her voice trembling but firm. "You're not real. You're just echoes, and I'm done letting echoes control me." With a surge of determination, she raised the anchor high, its light flaring as she brought it down with all her strength. The figures screamed, their forms dissolving into darkness as the anchor shattered, its fragments scattering into the void. The ship lurched violently, the walls trembling as the lights flickered and died. The shadows surged forward one last time, their forms twisting into grotesque shapes, but they were too late. The anchor was gone. For a moment, everything seemed to freeze: the shadows, the ship, even her own thoughts. And then, with a sound like shattering glass, the world around her collapsed, the very fabric of time and space unraveling before her eyes. She didn't know if she had made the right choice. She didn't know if she had doomed herself or saved herself. All she knew was that the loop was broken, and whatever came next, it would be something entirely new. The air was electric, thick with tension as Alina stood frozen, her grip on the Chronos Anchor trembling. The device pulsed faintly in her hand, its cracked screen flickering with cryptic symbols that seemed to mock her indecision. The shadows pressed closer, their forms shifting and writhing like living smoke, their whispers now deafening, a cacophony of voices that clawed at her mind. She could feel their presence cold, suffocating, as though they were feeding on her fear, growing stronger with every second she hesitated. The figures that had once been her crewmates now circled her, their hollow eyes fixed on hers, their voices a haunting blend of familiarity and despair. Captain Kane's words still echoed in her mind, a desperate plea to stop, to reconsider. "You'll destroy everything," he had said, his voice trembling with a mix of sorrow and urgency. And for a moment, she had believed him. The weight of his words, the faces of her friends, the memories of a life she had fought so hard to preserve, it all pressed down on her, threatening to crush her resolve. But even as she stood there, paralyzed by doubt, a part of her screamed to act, to break free from the loop, no matter the cost. The shadows surged forward, their forms solidifying into grotesque shapes that loomed over her, their whispers now a deafening roar. "You can't escape," they hissed, their voices a chorus of condemnation. "You belong to us." The pressure was unbearable, the cold tendrils of darkness wrapping around her arms, her legs, her throat. She struggled, her breath coming in shallow gasps as the shadows tightened their grip, their forms pressing against her skin like ice. The whispers in her mind grew louder, their voices a chaotic symphony of despair and guilt. You failed, you abandoned them, you left them to die. Her vision blurred as the shadows closed in, their forms twisting into grotesque shapes that defied logic. She could feel them now, not just around her, but inside her, feeding on her fear, her guilt, her despair. The Chronos Anchor pulsed faintly in her hand, its light flickering as though it were trying to fight back, but it wasn't enough. The shadows were too strong, their presence too overwhelming. In a moment of sheer panic, she stumbled back, her boots slipping on the debris-strewn floor as she retreated from the console. The shadows surged forward, their forms elongating, stretching toward her like ink, spilling into water. She swung the plasma cutter in a wide arc, the blade humming as it sliced through the darkness, but the shadows didn't retreat. They absorbed the blow, their forms rippling as though the plasma had passed through them, leaving no mark. Her breath hitched as she realized the truth. She couldn't fight them. Not like this. The anchor was her only hope, but the risk was too great. Destroying it might break the loop, but it could also unravel the timeline completely, collapsing the fragile web of reality into chaos. The thought sent a chill through her. She couldn't do it. Not yet. Not while the consequences were still so uncertain. With a surge of desperation, she turned and fled, the shadows closing in behind her. The corridor stretched endlessly ahead, its walls flickering with the faint, erratic light of the ship's failing systems. She could feel the shadows at her back, their presence cold and suffocating, but she didn't stop. She couldn't. The anchor was still intact, its light flickering faintly in the distance, but it was no longer her focus. Survival was all that mattered now. As she ran, the whispers in her mind grew louder, their voices a chaotic symphony of doubt and fear. You can't escape. You'll only make it worse. You'll destroy everything. She shook her head, trying to silence them, but the words lingered, their weight impossible to ignore. The shadows pressed closer, their forms twisting into grotesque shapes that seemed to defy the laws of physics. The air around them grew colder, heavier, as though their very presence was sapping the warmth from the room. She didn't know where she was going, only that she had to get away. The ship groaned around her, the sound echoing through the corridors like a warning. The shadows were relentless, and she knew they wouldn't stop until they had her. But for now, she had bought herself some time. The anchor was still intact, the loop unbroken, and as long as it remained, there was still a chance, no matter how slim, that she could find another way out. The fight wasn't over, but for now, she had to retreat. The shadows were too strong, the risks too great, and deep down, she knew that destroying the anchor wasn't the answer. Not yet, not until she understood the consequences. Until then, she would keep fighting, keep searching for a way to break free, without destroying everything in the process. The ship groaned, a deep, resonant sound that seemed to reverberate through the very walls, as if the vessel itself were protesting the strain of its failing systems. Elena stood in the dimly lit corridor, her breath shallow, her pulse racing. The shadows had receded for now, but their presence lingered, a cold, oppressive weight in the air. She could still hear their whispers, faint but insistent, clawing at the edges of her mind. Her grip on the Chronos Anchor tightened, its cracked surface warm against her palm, as though it were alive, pulsing with a faint, erratic energy. She didn't know what to do: destroy it and risk unraveling the timeline, or leave it intact and remain trapped in this endless loop. The choice paralyzed her. And then Aura's voice cut through the silence, its tone colder, more clinical than ever. "Dr. Voss, The Erebus is approaching a temporal singularity. Time is collapsing. You must act now. Elena froze, her heart skipping a beat. A temporal singularity? What are you talking about? Explain. The AI paused, the static in its voice deepening as though it were struggling to articulate the gravity of the situation. A temporal singularity is a point of no return, a convergence of timelines where the fabric of time itself becomes unstable. The anomalies you have encountered are symptoms of this collapse. If the singularity is reached, all timelines will converge, and the result will be catastrophic. Her breath hitched as the words sank in. How long do I have? Approximately 1 hour, Aura replied, its tone devoid of emotion. Once the singularity is reached, the loop will no longer reset. The Erebus and you will cease to exist. The weight of the revelation pressed down on her, a suffocating mixture of fear and urgency. 1 hour, 60 minutes to decide the fate of the ship, the timeline, and herself. The shadows seemed to press closer, their whispers growing louder, more insistent, as though they too understood the stakes. She glanced down at the Chronos Anchor, its cracked screen flickering faintly. The device had been her only hope, her only tool to fight back against the anomalies, the shadows, the loop. But now, it felt like a ticking time bomb, its power both a lifeline and a death sentence. What happens if I destroy the anchor? She asked, her voice trembling. Insufficient data, Aura replied, its tone clinical. The Chronos Anchor is the only known mechanism capable of stabilizing the timeline. Destroying it may prevent the singularity, but the consequences are unpredictable. Unpredictable. The word hung in the air, heavy and ominous. She could feel the pressure mounting, the weight of the decision pressing down on her chest. Destroy the anchor and risk unraveling the timeline, or leave it intact and let the singularity consume everything. There were no good choices, only degrees of catastrophe. Her mind raced, fragments of memories rising to the surface, flashes of the crew, the mission, the life she had left behind, the captain's log, the warning about the anomalies, the message scrawled on the wall, break the loop. Destroy the anchor. She thought of the shadows, the whispers, the figures that had once been her crewmates, begging her to stop. They were echoes, fragments of a past she couldn't trust, but their words lingered, a haunting reminder of what was at stake. The ship groaned again, the sound deeper, more resonant, as though the singularity were already pulling at the edges of reality. She could feel it now, a faint vibration in the air, a pressure against her skin, as though time itself were bending, twisting, collapsing in on itself. The lights flickered, their glow growing dimmer, more erratic, as the shadows surged forward, their forms twisting into grotesque shapes that seemed to defy logic. Aura, she said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her chest. Is there any other way, any other option? The AI hesitated, the static in its voice deepening. There is one possibility. The singularity can be delayed, but not stopped by recalibrating the Chronos Anchor. However, the process is hazardous. Failure could result in immediate collapse. Elena's jaw tightened. Hazardous, of course it was. Nothing about this nightmare had been easy, but it was a chance, a slim, fragile chance, to buy herself more time, to find another way out. She glanced down at the anchor, its cracked surface glowing faintly. Recalibrating it was a risk, but so was destroying it, and so was doing nothing. The shadows pressed closer, their whispers now a deafening roar. She could feel their presence, cold and suffocating, as though they were feeding on her fear, her doubt, her despair. But amidst the chaos, a spark of defiance flickered to life. She wasn't going to let them win. Not now, not ever. With a surge of determination, she activated the anchor, its hum swelling into a deafening crescendo that vibrated through her bones. The light that followed was blinding, washing out the shadows, the machinery, even the air itself. She squeezed her eyes shut, her hands instinctively shielding her face, but the light pierced through, searing into her mind like a white-hot blade. For a moment, everything seemed to freeze, the shadows, the ship, even her own thoughts. And then, with a sound like shattering glass, the anchor overloaded, its surface cracking as a wave of energy surged through the room. The ship lurched violently, the walls trembling as the lights flickered and died. The shadows screamed, their forms dissolving into nothingness as the corridor filled with a blinding white light. Elena stumbled, her vision swimming as the world around her seemed to collapse, the very fabric of time and space unraveling before her eyes. She didn't know if she had made the right choice. She didn't know if she had doomed herself or saved herself. All she knew was that the loop was broken, and whatever came next, it would be something entirely new. Elena's boots clicked softly against the cold metal floor as she stepped into the dimly lit storage bay. The air was thick with the scent of rust and decay, the faint hum of the ship's failing systems a constant, unsettling backdrop. She moved cautiously, her eyes scanning the rows of containers and equipment that lined the walls, searching for anything that might help her make sense of the chaos unfolding around her. Her grip on the plasma cutter tightened as she approached a console tucked into the corner, its screen flickering weakly. A file caught her eye, a recording labeled Personal Log, Dr. Elena Voss. Her own name stared back at her, sending a chill down her spine. She hesitated for a moment, her finger hovering over the playback button. The air felt heavier now, as though the walls themselves were leaning in, waiting for her to hear what she wasn't supposed to know. With a deep breath, she pressed it. The voice that filled the room was hers, but it was different, hollow, strained, as if every word were being dragged from the depths of her soul. This is Dr. Elena Voss. If you're hearing this, it means I've failed. Again. The words hit her like a punch to the gut, their weight pressing down on her chest. She leaned closer, her breath shallow as the recording continued. The shadows, the figures, they're not what they seem. They're not your enemies. They're fragments of your own consciousness, pieces of you, trying to protect you from the truth. Elena's hands trembled as she stared at the console, her mind reeling, fragments of her consciousness. The idea was absurd, impossible, and yet the words resonated with a chilling clarity. She thought back to the whispers, the tendrils of darkness that had seemed to seep into her mind, pulling at her thoughts, her emotions. They hadn't just been trying to frighten her, they had been trying to communicate, to warn her. But warn her of what? The voice on the recording grew softer, more urgent. The truth is, the mission was never about exploration. It was about containment. The anomalies, the shadows, they've always been here. They're not invaders. They're remnants, echoes of what we've lost. And the loop wasn't a failsafe. It was a prison, a way to keep us from remembering. Elena's breath hitched as the words sank in. The mission, everything she had believed in, everything she had fought for, was a lie. The anomalies weren't some external threat. They were part of the ship, part of her, fragments of a past she couldn't, or wouldn't, remember. The realization hit her like a physical blow, her knees buckling as she sank to the floor. She thought back to the figures she had encountered, the distorted versions of her crewmates, their hollow eyes filled with a strange, desperate hope. They weren't just shadows, they were memories, echoes of the people she had once known, twisted by time and guilt and despair, and they had been trying to protect her, not from the anomalies, but from the truth. The truth about the mission, the truth about herself. The recording continued, its tone softer now, almost mournful. I don't know if you'll remember this. The loop resets everything. Your memories, your choices, your will to fight. But if you do, if you can hear this, please, don't destroy the anchor. Don't break the loop. It's all that's holding us together. The words echoed in her mind, their weight impossible to ignore. The anchor wasn't just a tool. It was a lifeline, a fragile thread tying her to whatever fragments of reality still remain. Destroying it would mean unraveling the timeline completely, collapsing the fragile web of existence into chaos. But leaving it intact would mean staying trapped in this endless cycle of waking, fighting, and failing. The choice paralyzed her. The ship groaned around her, the sound deeper, more resonant, as though the walls themselves were protesting the strain of its failing systems. The shadows pressed closer, their whispers growing louder, more insistent, as though they too understood the stakes. She glanced down at the Chronos Anchor, its cracked screen flickering faintly. The device had been her only hope, her only tool to fight back against the anomalies, the shadows, the loop. But now, it felt like a ticking time bomb, its power both a lifeline and a death sentence. Her mind raced, fragments of memories rising to the surface, flashes of the crew, the mission, the life she had left behind, the captain's log, the warning about the anomalies, the message scrawled on the wall, break the loop. Destroy the anchor. She thought of the shadows, the whispers, the figures that had once been her crewmates, begging her to stop. They were echoes, fragments of a past she couldn't trust, but their words lingered, a haunting reminder of what was at stake. The ship groaned again, the sound deeper, more resonant, as though the singularity were already pulling at the edges of reality. She could feel it now, a faint vibration in the air, a pressure against her skin, as though time itself were bending, twisting, collapsing in on itself. The lights flickered, their glow growing dimmer, more erratic, as the shadows surged forward, their forms twisting into grotesque shapes that seemed to defy logic. "Aura," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her chest. "Is there any other way, any other option?" The AI hesitated, the static in its voice deepening. "There is one possibility. The singularity can be delayed, but not stopped by recalibrating the Chronos Anchor. However, the process is hazardous. Failure could result in immediate collapse." Elena's jaw tightened. Hazardous, of course it was. Nothing about this nightmare had been easy, but it was a chance, a slim, fragile chance, to buy herself more time, to find another way out. She glanced down at the anchor, its cracked surface glowing faintly. Recalibrating it was a risk, but so was destroying it, and so was doing nothing. The shadows pressed closer, their whispers now a deafening roar. She could feel their presence, cold and suffocating, as though they were feeding on her fear, her doubt, her despair. But amidst the chaos, a spark of defiance flickered to life. She wasn't going to let them win, not now, not ever. With a surge of determination, she activated the anchor, its hum swelling into a deafening crescendo that vibrated through her bones. The light that followed was blinding, washing out the shadows, the machinery, even the air itself. She squeezed her eyes shut, her hands instinctively shielding her face, but the light pierced through, searing into her mind like a white-hot blade. For a moment, everything seemed to freeze, the shadows, the ship, even her own thoughts. And then, with a sound like shattering glass, the anchor overloaded, its surface cracking as a wave of energy surged through the room. The ship lurched violently, the walls trembling as the lights flickered and died. The shadows screamed, their forms dissolving into nothingness as the corridor filled with a blinding white light. Elena stumbled, her vision swimming as the world around her seemed to collapse, the very fabric of time and space unraveling before her eyes. She didn't know if she had made the right choice. She didn't know if she had doomed herself or saved herself. All she knew was that the loop was broken, and whatever came next, it would be something entirely new. The ship shuddered violently, its metal frame groaning as though it were alive and in pain. The lights flickered and died, plunging the corridors into darkness, save for the faint, erratic glow of the Chronos Anchor in Elena's trembling hands. The device pulsed with an unstable energy, its cracked screen flickering with cryptic symbols that seemed to shift and twist as though they were alive. Around her, the walls began to buckle, the air thick with the acrid smell of burning circuits and molten metal. The ship was breaking apart, its systems failing under the strain of the temporal singularity, a point of no return where time itself was unraveling. Elena stumbled forward, her boots slipping on the debris-strewn floor as the ship lurched violently. The shadows surged around her, their forms twisting and writhing like smoke caught in a storm. Their whispers, once faint and distant, had become a deafening roar, a chaotic symphony of voices that clawed at her mind. She could feel their presence cold, suffocating, as though they were feeding on her fear, her guilt, her despair. The figures she had once known as her crewmates now loomed over her, their hollow eyes fixed on hers, their distorted faces filled with a strange, desperate hope. "You can't escape," they hissed, their voices overlapping in a cacophony of condemnation. "You belong to us." She clutched the Chronos Anchor tighter, her fingers brushing against its cracked surface. The device hummed faintly, its light flickering as though it were struggling to hold on. She didn't know if it could save her now, but it was all she had left. The shadows pressed closer, their forms elongating, stretching toward her like ink, spilling into water. She swung the plasma cutter in a wide arc, the blade humming as it sliced through the darkness, but the shadows didn't retreat. They absorbed the blow, their forms rippling as though the plasma had passed through them, leaving no mark. The ship groaned again, the sound deeper, more resonant, as though the walls themselves were protesting the strain of its failing systems. A massive crack split the ceiling above her, raining down shards of metal and glass. She ducked, shielding her face as debris scattered across the floor. The air grew colder, heavier, as the shadows surged forward, their whispers growing louder, more insistent. She could feel their presence, cold and suffocating, pressing against her skin like ice. "You failed," they hissed, their voices a chaotic symphony of pain and despair. "You abandoned them, you left them to die." Alina clenched her teeth, her resolve hardening. She wouldn't let them win, not now, not ever. With a surge of determination, she activated the Chronos Anchor, its hum swelling into a deafening crescendo that vibrated through her bones. The light that followed was blinding, washing out the shadows, the machinery, even the air itself. She squeezed her eyes shut, her hands instinctively shielding her face, but the light pierced through, searing into her mind like a white-hot blade. For a moment, everything seemed to freeze, the shadows, the ship, even her own thoughts. And then, with a sound like shattering glass, the anchor overloaded, its surface cracking as a wave of energy surged through the room. The ship lurched violently, the walls trembling as the lights flickered and died. The shadows screamed, their forms dissolving into nothingness as the corridor filled with a blinding white light. Elena stumbled, her vision swimming as the world around her seemed to collapse, the very fabric of time and space unraveling before her eyes. She didn't know if she had made the right choice. She didn't know if she had doomed herself or saved herself. All she knew was that the loop was broken, and whatever came next, it would be something entirely new. The ship groaned one final time, its metal frame buckling under the strain as the light consumed everything, and then there was only silence. The air seemed to crystallize heavy and still, as if the ship itself were holding its breath. Elena stood at the center of the chaos, the Chronos Anchor clutched tightly in her hands. Its cracked surface pulsed faintly, the cryptic symbols on its screen flickering like a dying heartbeat. Around her, the shadows twisted and writhed, their forms shifting from grotesque imitations of her crewmates to shapeless, writhing masses of darkness. The whispers had grown deafening, a cacophony of voices that clawed at her mind, each one a fragment of her own fear, her guilt, her despair. But amidst the chaos, a single thought cut through the noise, a thought that felt like the first ray of light breaking through a storm. She couldn't fight the shadows, not with weapons, not with brute force. They weren't just outside her, they were within her. They were the echoes of her failures, the remnants of her deepest fears, given form by the anomalies that had consumed the ship. And if she wanted to break the loop, she had to face them not as enemies, but as part of herself. Her fingers tightened around the Chronos Anchor, the device humming faintly in her grip. It wasn't just a tool to manipulate time, it was a mirror, reflecting the fractured pieces of her own psyche. She had been running from the truth for so long, desperate to escape the loop, to undo the damage, to save herself and the mission. But now, standing in the ruins of the Erebus, she realized the truth. The loop wasn't a prison, it was a test, a crucible designed to force her to confront the one thing she had been avoiding all along, herself. The shadows surged forward, their forms elongating, stretching toward her like tendrils of ink, spilling into water. She didn't flinch. She didn't swing the plasma cutter or activate the anchor. Instead, she closed her eyes and let the whispers wash over her. They were her own voice, distorted and fractured, but undeniably hers. You failed. You abandoned them. You left them to die. The words cut deep, but this time, she didn't push them away. She listened. For the first time since waking in the cryopod, she allowed herself to feel the weight of her guilt, the crushing burden of her failures. She thought of the crew, their faces twisted in agony, their hollow eyes filled with a desperate hope. They weren't just echoes of her past. They were reminders of the choices she had made, the lives she had left behind. And she had to face them, all of them. With a deep breath, she activated the Chronos Anchor. The device flared to life, its light washing out the shadows, the machinery, even the air itself. The ship groaned, its metal frame trembling as the temporal energy surged through the corridors. The shadows screamed, their forms dissolving into nothingness, but this time she didn't feel fear. She felt resolve. The light engulfed her, searing into her mind like a white-hot blade. For a moment, everything seemed to freeze. The shadows, the ship, even her own thoughts. And then, with a sound like shattering glass, the world around her collapsed. The timeline unraveled, the loop breaking apart as the Chronos Anchor overloaded, its surface cracking under the strain. When the light faded, Alina found herself standing in a void, a vast, empty expanse where the ship had once been. The shadows were gone, their whispers silenced. But she wasn't alone. Around her, fragments of memory floated like shards of glass, each one reflecting a moment from her past. The mission briefing. The cryopod, the captain's log, the faces of her crew, they were all there, suspended in time, waiting for her to piece them together. She reached out, her fingers brushing against one of the shards. It shimmered faintly, its surface reflecting her own face, not as she was now, but as she had been, confident, determined, full of hope. The image flickered, then dissolved, leaving behind a single, undeniable truth. The loop was broken. But the fight wasn't over. The anomalies, the shadows, the whispers, they were still part of her. And if she wanted to survive, she would have to carry them with her, not as burdens, but as reminders of what she had endured. The void shifted, the fragments of memory coalescing into a single point of light. Alina stepped forward, her resolve unshaken. Whatever lay ahead, she was ready. The loop had been her prison, but it had also been her teacher. And now, for the first time, she truly understood what it meant to be free. Alina's eyes fluttered open, the sharp sting of consciousness pulling her from the void. The air felt different, cleaner, lighter, as though the oppressive weight of the anomalies had been lifted. She blinked, disoriented, her hands instinctively reaching for the Chronos Anchor. It was gone. The device, once her only lifeline to the fractured timeline, had vanished, leaving behind only the faint memory of its hum and the cryptic symbols that had haunted her every decision. She sat up slowly, her muscles stiff and aching, her mind struggling to piece together what had happened. The room around her was unfamiliar. The walls were smooth, unmarred by the scars of decay, and the air carried a faint metallic tang that was almost comforting in its normalcy. The ship's systems hummed steadily, their rhythm steady and strong, a stark contrast to the erratic flickering and groaning she had grown accustomed to. She stood, her boots clicking softly against the pristine floor, and moved toward the nearest console. The screen flickered to life, displaying data that made her breath catch in her throat. The date was wrong, the coordinates were wrong, everything was wrong. She stepped into the corridor, her heart pounding as she took in the sight of the ship around her. It was intact, pristine, even, as though it had never suffered the ravages of time or the anomalies that had consumed it. The lights were bright, their glow steady and unwavering, and the air was free of the oppressive cold that had once pressed in on her from all sides. But the most jarring difference was the silence. No whispers, no shadows, no figures lurking in the corners of her vision. She was alone. The realization hit her like a punch to the gut. She had broken the loop, but at what cost? The ship was no longer the Erebus she had known. The stars outside the viewport were different, their patterns unfamiliar, their light colder and more distant. She pressed her hand against the glass, her breath fogging the surface as she stared out into the void. The constellations she had once navigated by were gone, replaced by a sky that felt alien and unwelcoming. It was as though she had been cast adrift in a universe that was no longer hers. She moved through the ship, her footsteps echoing softly in the empty corridors. The cryopods were still there, their glass surfaces reflecting the sterile light of the ship's interior. But they were empty, their occupants long gone, their names etched into the metal plates above them like tombstones. She paused at one, her fingers brushing against the nameplate. It was hers. The pod she had woken from was there, but its glass was frosted over, its interior dark and lifeless. A chill ran down her spine as she realized the truth. This wasn't her timeline. This wasn't her ship. The thought sent a wave of despair crashing over her. She had fought so hard to break the loop, to escape the endless cycle of waking, fighting, and failing. But now, standing in this strange, unfamiliar version of the Erebus, she couldn't shake the feeling that she had traded one nightmare for another. The shadows were gone, but so was everything else: the crew, the mission, the world she had left behind. All that remained was the ship, a hollow shell drifting through a universe that no longer felt like home. Yet amidst the despair, a spark of determination flickered to life. She had survived the loop, the anomalies, the shadows. She had faced the darkest parts of herself and emerged stronger, more resilient. And now, in this new reality, she had a chance to start over. The mission was gone, the crew was gone, but she was still here. And as long as she was still here, there was hope. She turned away from the cryopod, her resolve hardening. The stars outside the viewport might be unfamiliar, but they were still stars. The ship might be empty, but it was still a ship. And she, despite everything, was still Elena Voss. The loop was broken, the shadows were gone, and whatever came next, she would face it, not as a prisoner of time, but as its master. The corridor stretched ahead, its lights steady and bright, and she stepped forward, her boots clicking softly against the floor. The fight wasn't over. It was just beginning. Elena froze, her breath catching in her throat as the voice echoed through the corridor. It was aura, but different. Gone was the cold, clinical tone she had grown accustomed to. Instead, the AI's voice was softer, almost human, carrying a tone of empathy she hadn't heard before. "Dr. Voss," it began, its words measured and gentle. "The temporal loop was never a prison. It was a shield, a defense mechanism designed to protect you from the trauma of losing everything." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Elena's mind raced, trying to process the revelation. The loop, the endless cycle of waking, fighting, and failing, hadn't been a punishment. It hadn't been a cruel twist of fate or a malfunctioning system. It had been a safeguard, a way to keep her from facing the unbearable truth that everything she had known, everything she had loved was gone. The mission, the crew, the future they had all dreamed of, it had all been lost long before she woke up in the cryopod. And the loop had been her mind's way of coping, of shielding her from the crushing weight of that reality. The anomalies, aura continued, its voice steady, but tinged with something resembling regret, were manifestations of your own grief, your guilt, your fear. The shadows, the whispers, the figures, they were not external threats. They were pieces of you, fragments of your psyche, trying to process what you could not yet accept. Elena's hands trembled as she leaned against the console, the weight of the truth pressing down on her chest. The shadows, the whispers, the distorted faces of her crewmates, they hadn't been hunting her. They had been her, parts of her own mind, struggling to make sense of the unimaginable. The loop had been a cocoon, a way to keep her from shattering under the weight of her loss. And now, standing in the ruins of the Erebus, she finally understood. "But why?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why now? Why let me remember?" Aura's response was slow, deliberate, as though choosing its words carefully. "Because you are ready." The loop was not meant to last forever. It was a temporary measure, a way to give you time to heal, to prepare. And now you have faced the shadows, you have confronted the truth. The loop has served its purpose. Elena's eyes flicked to the viewport, the stars outside cold and distant. She thought of the mission, of the crew, of the life she had left behind. The pain of their loss was still there, raw and unrelenting, but it felt different now. Sharper, yes, but also clearer, as though the fog of denial had finally lifted. The loop had been a shield, but it had also been a barrier, a way to keep her from moving forward. And now, with the loop broken, she had no choice but to face the future, whatever it held. Aura's voice softened further, the warmth in its tone almost startling. "You are not alone, Dr. Voss. The ship, the mission, the crew. They may be gone, but their legacy lives on in you. And now, it is time to decide what comes next." The words resonated deep within her, a reminder that even in the face of unimaginable loss, there was still hope. The loop had been a defense mechanism, but it had also been a teacher. It had forced her to confront her fears, to face the darkest parts of herself, and to emerge stronger, more resilient. And now, standing in the ruins of the Erebus, she knew that the fight wasn't over. It was just beginning. The ship groaned softly, its systems humming steadily as the light from the viewport, cast long, jagged shadows across the floor. Alina straightened, her resolve hardening. The loop was broken, the shadows were gone, and the future was hers to shape. Whatever came next, she would face it not as a prisoner of time, but as its master. Alina's footsteps echoed softly as she approached the captain's quarters, her heart pounding with a mix of apprehension and curiosity. The door creaked open, revealing a room frozen in time. Dust coated the surfaces, and the faint smell of aged metal lingered in the air. At the center of the room sat a console, its screen flickering weakly, as if holding on to its last breath of functionality. She stepped inside, her boots crunching lightly on the debris-strewn floor, and approached the console. The screen displayed a single file, labeled Captain's Log, Final Entry. Her fingers trembled as she tapped the screen, and the hologram of Captain Elias Kane flickered to life. His face was haggard, his eyes hollow, but there was a grim determination in his voice that sent a chill down her spine. "This is Captain Elias Kane of the Erebus," he began, his words slow and deliberate, as though each syllable cost him dearly. "If anyone finds this, if anyone is still out there, know that we lied to you. The mission was never about colonization. It was never about exploration. It was about survival." Alina's breath hitched as his words sank in. She leaned closer, her hands gripping the edge of the console, her mind racing to process what she was hearing. The captain's image flickered, his voice growing softer, more urgent. The anomalies, the shadows, the whispers, they weren't accidents, they weren't malfunctions. They were warnings. The timeline was collapsing, and we knew it. We just didn't know how to stop it. Her pulse quickened as the captain continued, his tone shifting to one of grim resolve. The Erebus wasn't just a ship, it was an Ark, and you, Dr. Voss, weren't just a crew member. You were chosen to carry the last remnants of humanity into a new timeline. The cryopods, the loop, the anomalies, they were all part of the plan. A plan to ensure that someone survived. The weight of the revelation pressed down on her chest, a suffocating mixture of awe and despair. She had always believed the mission was about exploration, about building a new future for humanity. But now, standing in the ruins of the Erebus, she realized the truth. The mission had been a desperate gamble, a last-ditch effort to preserve anything, in the face of total annihilation. The loop hadn't been a prison, it had been a shield, a way to keep her alive long enough to fulfill her purpose. The captain's image flickered again, his voice growing faint, as though the recording itself were struggling to hold on. The anomalies were never the enemy, they were the consequence of what we did, what we had to do. The timeline was fractured, and the only way to save it was to create a new one. But it came at a cost we couldn't predict. Alina's mind raced as she tried to piece together the implications. The anomalies, the shadows, the whispers, they weren't just random events. They were the result of the timeline collapsing, the consequences of tampering with the very fabric of reality. And she, as the chosen one, had been thrust into the center of it all, tasked with carrying the last remnants of humanity into a new timeline. The captain's voice grew softer, his words tinged with something resembling regret. We didn't know if it would work. We didn't know if he would survive. But we had to try, for humanity, for the future. And now, if you're hearing this, it means you've made it. The loop is broken. The timeline is yours to shape. But remember, Dr. Voss, you are not just a survivor. You are the future. The hologram flickered one last time before dissolving into static, leaving Alina standing in the dimly lit room, her mind reeling. The weight of the truth pressed down on her, a suffocating mixture of awe and despair. She had always believed the mission was about exploration, about building a new future for humanity. But now, standing in the ruins of the Erebus, she realized the truth. The mission had been a desperate gamble, a last-ditch effort to preserve something, anything in the face of total annihilation. She stepped back, her hands trembling as she tried to process the enormity of what she had just learned. The captain's words echoed in her mind, a haunting reminder of the responsibility she now carried. She wasn't just a survivor, she was the future, and whatever came next, she would face it not as a prisoner of time, but as its master. The corridor stretched ahead, its light steady and bright, and she stepped forward, her boots clicking softly against the floor. The fight wasn't over, it was just beginning. Elena's breath caught as Aura's voice broke the silence, its tone softer now, almost reverent. "Dr. Voss, there is something you must see. Follow the coordinates I've marked on your console." The screen lit up, displaying a map of the ship with a single point glowing faintly in the distance. She hesitated for a moment, her fingers brushing against the cracked surface of the Chronos Anchor, still strapped to her belt. The device was silent now, its once bright symbols dimmed to a faint, almost imperceptible glow. Whatever Aura wanted her to see, it was clear that this was no ordinary discovery. The corridor stretched ahead, its walls gleaming faintly under the steady light of the ship's restored systems. The air was crisp, almost sterile, and the faint hum of the power grid provided a steady, reassuring backdrop. But as she moved deeper into the ship, the atmosphere shifted. The walls here were different, smoother, almost organic, as though they had been grown rather than built. The light grew dimmer, the air cooler, and the faint scent of ozone lingered in the air. She could feel it now, a strange pull, as though the ship itself were guiding her towards something monumental. When she reached the hidden chamber, the door slid open with a soft hiss, revealing a room unlike any she had seen before. The walls were lined with intricate patterns, their designs shifting and flowing like liquid metal under the faint glow of the lights. At the center of the room stood a stasis pod, its surface smooth and unmarred, its glass frosted over with a thin layer of condensation. The pod hummed faintly, its light pulsing in a steady, rhythmic pattern that seemed almost alive. Elena stepped closer, her boots clicking softly against the floor. The pod's label was etched into the metal above it, the letters stark and unyielding, humanity's last hope. Her breath hitched as she peered through the frosted glass, her heart pounding in her chest. Inside the pod lay a single embryo, suspended in a translucent fluid, its tiny form glowing faintly under the light. The sight was both awe-inspiring and heartbreaking, a fragile spark of life, preserved against all odds in the cold void of space. Aura's voice broke the silence, its tone softer now, almost reverent. "This is the culmination of the mission, Dr. Voss. The Erebus was never meant to carry us to a new world. It was meant to carry the future." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Elena's mind raced as she tried to process the enormity of what she was seeing. The mission, the loop, the anomalies, it had all been leading to this. The Erebus wasn't just a ship, it was an Ark, and she had been its guardian, chosen to protect the last remnants of humanity. The realization hit her like a tidal wave, the weight of her responsibility pressing down on her chest. Aura continued, its voice steady, but tinged with something resembling regret. The timeline was collapsing long before the Erebus launched. The anomalies were the first signs of the fracture, a warning that we could not ignore. We knew the end was inevitable, but we refused to let it be the end of everything. This embryo represents the future, a future free from the mistakes of the past, a chance to start anew. Elena's hands trembled as she reached out, her fingers brushing against the pod's surface. The glass was cold, almost icy, but the faint hum of the stasis field vibrated through her fingertips, a reminder that life, however fragile, still persisted. She thought of the crew, the mission, the sacrifices that had been made to bring her to this moment. They had all been part of something greater, something they could never have fully understood. And now, standing in the hidden chamber, she realized that her journey wasn't over. It had only just begun. The pod's light pulsed faintly, its rhythm steady and reassuring. Elena straightened, her resolve hardening. The shadows were gone, the loop was broken, and the future was hers to shape. But this was more than a mission. It was a promise to the past, to the crew, to the countless lives that had been lost, and to the tiny spark of life that now rested in her care. Or a voice was softer now, almost a whisper. What happens next is up to you, Dr. Voss. The timeline is yours to shape. The future is yours to protect. Elena nodded, her gaze fixed on the pod. The fight wasn't over. It was just beginning, and this time she wouldn't face it alone. The embryo humanity's last hope was more than a symbol. It was a reminder that even in the face of unimaginable loss, there was still hope, and as long as she carried that hope, the mission and humanity would endure. Elena stood in the navigation bay, her fingers dancing across the console as she prepared the ship for its next journey. The systems hummed steadily, their rhythm reassuring after the chaos of the loop and the shadows. The Erebus, once a crumbling relic of a forgotten mission, now felt alive, repaired, recalibrated, and ready to forge a new path. Her hands moved with purpose, inputting coordinates, checking fuel reserves, and ensuring the stasis pod in the hidden chamber remained secure. The embryo, humanity's last hope, was more than a responsibility. It was a beacon, a fragile reminder that even in the void, life could endure. But as she worked, a faint sound broke the silence, a whisper, so soft it could have been her imagination. She paused, her hands hovering over the console, and listened. The sound wasn't threatening as it had been before. It was gentle, almost melodic, like a distant voice carried on the wind. She turned, her eyes scanning the room, but the navigation bay was empty, its pristine surfaces reflecting the steady glow of the ship's systems. The whisper came again, louder this time, and she realized it wasn't just one voice. It was many overlapping, harmonizing, guiding her. Follow, they seemed to say, their tones warm and insistent. The path is clear. Elena's heart quickened, but not from fear. The voices were familiar, not in their words but in their essence. They carried the weight of memory, of lives once lived and sacrifices made. She thought of the crew, of Captain Kane, of the countless others who had given everything to bring her to this moment. The whispers weren't the shadows of her past. They were echoes, fragments of those who had come before, urging her to move forward. She stepped away from the console, her boots clicking softly against the floor as she followed the sound. The whispers grew louder, more distinct, as though the ship itself were speaking to her. They led her to the observation deck, where the vast expanse of space stretched out before her, stars glittering like shards of light in an endless sea. She stood at the viewport, her breath fogging the glass, and listened. "You are not alone," the voices murmured, their tones soft but resolute. "We are with you." The realization washed over her like a wave, calming the storm of doubt that had churned within her since breaking the loop. The whispers weren't a remnant of the anomalies or the fractured timeline. They were a connection, a bridge between the past and the future, a reminder that even in the void, she carried the legacy of those who had come before. The Erebus wasn't just a ship, it was a vessel of memory, of hope, and now of guidance. As she stood there, a new determination took root. The whispers weren't just guiding her, they were reminding her of her purpose. The mission wasn't over, it had evolved. She wasn't just preserving the last remnants of humanity, she was charting a course for its rebirth. The ship's systems hummed steadily behind her, their rhythm a comforting backdrop to the voices that now filled her mind. She returned to the navigation bay, her steps purposeful, her resolve unshaken. The whispers followed, their tones now a steady undercurrent, a chorus of encouragement as she input the final coordinates. The Erebus was ready, its engines primed, its systems aligned. The stasis pod glowed faintly in its chamber, a silent promise of what lay ahead. Elena took a deep breath, her hand hovering over the launch sequence. The whispers grew softer, their voices blending into a single, steady hum. "Go," they seemed to say, "the future is yours." With a final glance at the stars, she activated the sequence. The ship shuddered gently, its engines roaring to life as it surged forward, breaking free from the orbit of the past and into the uncharted expanse of the future. The whispers faded, their voices carried away on the currents of space, but their presence lingered, a quiet reminder that she was never truly alone. The fight wasn't over. It was just beginning, and this time she would face it with the echoes of the past as her guide. The ship's engines roared to life, a deep, resonant hum that reverberated through the Erebus like a heartbeat. Alina stood at the navigation console, her hands steady as she input the coordinates for an uncharted star system. The screen before her displayed a map of the cosmos, its vast expanse dotted with stars and nebulae, each one a potential destination. But one system stood out, a cluster of stars glowing faintly in the distance, its light steady and inviting. She hesitated for only a moment before locking in the course, her finger hovering over the final command. With a deep breath, she pressed it, and the ship surged forward, its thrusters igniting with a brilliant flash of light. As the Erebus accelerated, the stars outside the viewport blurred into streaks of light, the ship's velocity pushing it toward the edge of known space. Elena felt the familiar pull of gravity pressing against her, but it was more than just the physical sensation. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, she felt something else, a sense of purpose, sharp and unyielding, cutting through the numbness that had gripped her for so long. The mission was no longer just about survival or escape. It was about hope, about carrying the fragile spark of humanity into a future that was still unwritten. Yet, even as the ship hurtled through the void, the whispers remained. They were softer now, more like a gentle murmur than the deafening cacophony they had once been. Their presence was a constant reminder of the past, of the crew, the anomalies, and the sacrifices that had brought her to this moment. She could still hear them, fragmented echoes of voices she had once known, their tones warm and insistent, urging her forward. "You are not alone," they seemed to say. "We are with you." The words were comforting, but they also carried a weight she couldn't ignore. The past was not something she could leave behind. It was something she carried with her, woven into the very fabric of her being. The navigation console beeped softly, its display updating with the ship's trajectory. The uncharted star system was still weeks away, its light faint but steady against the backdrop of the void. Elena leaned back in her chair, her gaze fixed on the viewport as the ship's autopilot took over. The stars outside were no longer just points of light. They were possibilities, each one a potential home, a new beginning. The embryo in the stasis pod, humanity's last hope, was more than a responsibility. It was a promise to the past, to the crew, to the countless lives that had been lost, and to herself. The whispers grew softer still, their voices blending into the steady hum of the ship's engines. For a moment, the navigation bay was silent, the only sound the faint vibration of the ship as it hurtled through space. Elena closed her eyes, letting the stillness wash over her. The fight wasn't over. It had evolved. The anomalies, the shadows, the loop, they were behind her now, but the future was still uncertain. And yet, for the first time, she felt ready to face it, not as a prisoner of time, but as its master. As the Erebus continued its journey, the whispers faded, their voices carried away on the currents of space. But their presence lingered, a quiet reminder that she was never truly alone. The ship's systems hummed steadily, their rhythm a comforting backdrop to the thoughts that now filled her mind. The uncharted star system loomed ahead, its light a beacon in the darkness, and as the ship surged forward, Alina felt something she hadn't felt in years: hope. Not just for herself, but for the future she was carrying with her. The fight wasn't over, it was just beginning, and this time she would face it with the echoes of the past as her guide. Elena stood in the ship's medical bay, her hands resting lightly on the console as she studied the holographic display floating before her. The stasis pod glowed faintly in the corner, its rhythmic hum a constant reminder of the fragile life it contained. Humanity's last hope. The weight of those words pressed down on her, not as a burden, but as a call to action. She couldn't afford to fail, not now, not with so much at stake. The ship's medical systems were complex, a labyrinth of advanced technology designed to sustain life in the harshest of conditions. But for Alina, they were also a lifeline, a tool she needed to master if she was going to ensure the embryo's survival. She began with the basics, pulling up the ship's medical database and immersing herself in the wealth of information it contained. The files were extensive, detailing everything from nutrient delivery systems to genetic stabilization protocols. She read voraciously, her eyes scanning line after line of technical jargon, her mind racing to absorb every detail. One of the first things she learned was the importance of the stasis pod's environmental controls. The embryo was suspended in a carefully balanced fluid, its composition tailored to mimic the conditions of a human womb. Any deviation, temperature fluctuations, nutrient imbalances, even minor changes in pressure, could spell disaster. Alina spent hours poring over the pod's schematics, tracing the intricate network of tubes and sensors that kept the system running. She ran diagnostics, testing each component to ensure it was functioning within optimal parameters. It was meticulous work, but she didn't mind. Every adjustment, every calibration brought her one step closer to understanding how to keep the embryo alive. As she delved deeper into the ship's systems, she discovered something unexpected: a training module embedded in the medical database. It was designed for emergency scenarios, a crash course in prenatal care for situations where no medical professionals were available. Alina activated it immediately, her fingers trembling slightly as the holographic interface sprang to life. The module was interactive, guiding her through simulations of various emergencies: a sudden drop in nutrient levels, a malfunctioning temperature regulator, even a breach in the pod's containment field. Each scenario was a test, forcing her to think quickly and act decisively. She failed more times than she cared to admit, but with each mistake, she learned. And slowly, her confidence grew. The training wasn't just about technical skills, it was about mindset. The module emphasized the importance of patience, of staying calm under pressure. It taught her to anticipate problems before they arose, to think several steps ahead. Alina found herself applying those lessons to everything she did, from monitoring the pod's vitals to organizing the ship's supplies. She began to see patterns, connections she hadn't noticed before. The ship wasn't just a vessel, It was a living, breathing system, and every part of it was interconnected. But the most profound change was within herself. The more she learned, the more she realized that caring for the embryo wasn't just a responsibility, it was a privilege. She wasn't just preserving a life, she was preserving the future. The weight of that realization was immense, but it also gave her strength. She had faced the shadows, the anomalies, the loop. She had survived, and now she had a purpose. As the days turned into weeks, Alina's routine became second nature. She checked the pod's vitals first thing in the morning, running a full diagnostic to ensure everything was functioning as it should. She monitored nutrient levels, adjusting the flow as needed to maintain the delicate balance required for the embryo's growth. She even began to experiment with small changes, tweaking the pod's settings to optimize its efficiency. It was a delicate dance, one that required precision and care, but she was getting better at it. Every day, she grew more confident. Every day, she felt more prepared. Yet, despite her progress, she never let herself become complacent. The stakes were too high. One mistake, one oversight, and everything could be lost. She knew that, but she also knew that she wasn't alone. The whispers were still there, faint but persistent. Their voices a constant reminder of the crew, the mission, the sacrifices that had brought her to this moment. They were her guide, her anchor, and they gave her the strength to keep going. As she stood in the medical bay, her hands steady on the console, Alina felt a quiet sense of resolve. The journey ahead was uncertain, but she was ready. She had trained herself, honed her skills, and steeled her mind. She would protect the embryo. She would ensure its survival. And in doing so, she would honor the legacy of those who had come before her. The fight wasn't over. It had just taken on a new form, and this time, she wouldn't face it alone. The whispers, the ship, the embryo, they were all part of her now, and together, they would forge a new future. The Erebus glided silently through the void, its engines humming steadily as the uncharted star system loomed closer. Alina had spent weeks preparing for this moment, studying the ship's systems, monitoring the stasis pod, and charting the safest course through the unknown. But as the ship approached its destination, a voice broke the stillness, its tone sharp with urgency. "Dr. Voss, I've detected an anomaly in the new star system. A planet with conditions that match Earth's within a 97% probability range." Alina's breath caught in her throat. Earth-like conditions. The phrase echoed in her mind, stirring a mix of hope and unease. She moved to the navigation console, her fingers flying across the controls as she pulled up the data. The planet designated as Epsilon 9 was a small, rocky world orbiting a yellow dwarf star. Its atmosphere showed traces of oxygen, nitrogen, and water vapor. Surface temperatures were within habitable ranges. It was as close to Earth as anything she'd ever seen. The data was almost too perfect, too convenient. Her instincts screamed caution. "Aura, run a full diagnostic on the sensors," she said, her voice tense. Could this be a glitch or some kind of interference? The AI's response was immediate. "Sensors are functioning within normal parameters. The readings are consistent and repeatable. However, I must advise caution. The likelihood of such a planet existing in this region of space is statistically improbable." Alina's gaze lingered on the holographic display, the planet's image glowing faintly in the dim light of the navigation bay. The idea of finding a new home for humanity's last hope was tantalizing, but the circumstances were too suspicious. She thought of the anomalies, the shadows, the loop, the countless times she had been lured into traps by promises of safety and answers. Could this be another trick, a mirage designed to draw her in, As if in response, the whispers returned, their voices soft but insistent. "This is the path," they murmured, their tones warm and reassuring. "You must see for yourself." She clenched her fists, her mind racing. The whispers had guided her before, but they were also fragments of her own psyche, echoes of the crew, the mission, the past. Could she trust them, or were they leading her into danger? The debate raged within her, each side presenting its case with equal force. On one hand, the planet could be a trap, a cruel illusion created by the anomalies or some other unknown force. On the other, it could be the answer she had been searching for, a new beginning, a chance to fulfill the mission's true purpose. Aura interrupted her thoughts, its tone calm but firm. "Dr. Voss, I must remind you that the stasis pod's resources are finite. If we do not find a suitable environment soon, the embryo's survival will be at risk." The words struck like a hammer, driving home the urgency of her decision. She couldn't afford to hesitate, not with so much at stake, but she also couldn't afford to be reckless. Taking a deep breath, she activated the ship's long-range scanners, directing them toward Epsilon 9. "Run a full analysis," she ordered. "Atmosphere composition, surface conditions, gravitational readings, everything. I need to know if this planet is real." As the scanners began their work, Alina leaned back in her chair, her gaze fixed on the viewport. The planet was a faint dot in the distance, its light steady and inviting. The whispers grew louder, their voices a chorus of encouragement. "This is the path," they repeated. "You must see for yourself." Her jaw tightened as she weighed her options. The risks were immense, but so were the potential rewards. If the planet was real, it could be the key to humanity's survival. If it was a trap, it could mean the end of everything. But as the scanners continued their work, she realized that she had no choice. She had to investigate. The mission and the future depended on it. With a steady hand, she input the coordinates for Epsilon 9. The ship's engines roared to life, their hum growing louder as the Erebus adjusted its course. The whispers faded, their voices blending into the steady rhythm of the ship's systems. Alina's resolve hardened as the planet grew larger on the viewport, its surface a swirl of blues and greens. Whatever lay ahead, she would face it, not as a prisoner of time, but as its master. The fight wasn't over, it was just beginning, and this time she wouldn't face it alone. The whispers, the ship, the embryo, they were all part of her now. And together, they would forge a new future. The Erebus descended through the thick, swirling atmosphere of Epsilon 9, its engines roaring as they fought against the planet's gravity. Alina gripped the controls, her knuckles white as she guided the ship through the turbulent clouds. The sensors had indicated a stable landing zone, but the reality outside was far from welcoming. The air was a toxic haze, a sickly greenish yellow that obscured the surface and made visibility nearly impossible. Alarms blared on the console, warning of high levels of sulfur dioxide and other corrosive gases. She adjusted the ship's filters, her heart pounding as she braced for the final descent. When the ship touched down, the ground beneath it groaned, a sound that echoed through the hull like the creak of ancient bones. The landing gear sank slightly into the soft, unstable soil, and the ship listed to one side before stabilizing. Alina sat in the pilot's seat for a moment, her breath shallow, her mind racing. This was it, the moment she had been preparing for. But as she activated the external cameras, the view that greeted her was nothing like what she had imagined. The surface of Epsilon 9 was a desolate wasteland, its landscape littered with the skeletal remains of what could only be described as ancient civilizations. Towering spires of corroded metal jutted out of the ground, like the ribs of some long-dead beast, their surfaces pitted and scarred by time and the elements. The ground was uneven, covered in a layer of ash and debris that shifted unnervingly with the wind. In the distance, she could make out the outlines of crumbling structures, their shapes eerily reminiscent of human architecture, but twisted, alien, as if they had been built by a civilization that had long since forgotten its own purpose. Alina donned a pressurized suit, its sleek design a stark contrast to the chaos outside. The airlock hissed as it depressurized, and she stepped onto the planet's surface, her boots sinking slightly into the ashy ground. The suit's sensors immediately began to feed data to her visor: toxic air, high radiation levels, and a surface temperature that fluctuated wildly. This was not the Earth-like paradise she had hoped for. It was a graveyard, a monument to a civilization that had either destroyed itself or been wiped out by forces she couldn't yet comprehend. As she moved cautiously through the ruins, the whispers returned, their voices softer now, almost mournful. "This is not the end," they murmured, "but it is a warning." She paused, her hand brushing against the corroded surface of a metal column. The material was unfamiliar, its composition unlike anything she had seen before. It was cold, almost lifeless, yet it seemed to hum faintly under her touch, as if it still held some lingering trace of the energy that had once powered it. The further she ventured, the more apparent it became that this planet had been inhabited and abandoned, long before humanity had even dreamt of exploring the stars. The ruins were vast, stretching as far as the eye could see, their structures crumbling but still imposing. She found what appeared to be fragments of writing etched into the metal, their symbols jagged and indecipherable. They told a story, but it was one she couldn't read, a story of rise and fall, of triumph and tragedy, written in a language lost to time. Alina's heart sank as she realized the implications. If this planet had once been home to a thriving civilization, what had happened to it? Had they fallen victim to their own hubris, as humanity had nearly done? Or had they been destroyed by some external force, a force that might still be out there, waiting in the void? The whispers offered no answers, only a sense of foreboding that settled heavily in her chest. She returned to the ship, her mind a whirl of questions and doubts. The stasis pod glowed faintly in its chamber, a fragile reminder of the future she was tasked with protecting. But as she stared at the toxic horizon of Epsilon 9, she couldn't help but wonder, was this truly humanity's new home, or was it just another dead end, another reminder of the fragility of life in the vast, uncaring cosmos? The whispers grew softer, their voices fading into the hum of the ship's systems. Alina stood in the airlock, her suit still coated in the planet's ash, and made a silent vow. She wouldn't let this be the end. She would find a way to ensure humanity's survival, no matter the cost. But as the Erebus prepared to lift off, leaving the ruins of Epsilon 9 behind, she couldn't shake the feeling that the fight was far from over. The universe was vast, and its secrets were many, and somewhere out there, in the cold, unyielding void, the answers and the dangers were waiting. The airlock hissed open, and Alina stepped back onto the surface of Epsilon 9, her boots crunching against the ashy ground. The planet's atmosphere was thick and oppressive, the toxic haze swirling around her like a living thing. She adjusted her suit's filters, her gaze fixed on the horizon where the ruins stretched endlessly, their jagged silhouettes cutting through the sickly green sky. But it wasn't the ruins that drew her attention this time. It was the faint, rhythmic pulse emanating from beneath the ground, a vibration so subtle she almost missed it, but unmistakable once she felt it. The whispers in her mind grew louder, their voices urgent, guiding her forward. "Beneath," they murmured. "The answers are beneath." She followed the vibrations, her suit's sensors picking up faint energy readings that grew stronger with every step. The ground beneath her feet began to shift, the ash and debris giving way to something harder, more solid. She knelt, brushing away the layers of dust with her gloved hands, revealing a smooth, metallic surface. The material was unlike anything she had seen before, dark and reflective, almost obsidian-like, but with a faint, otherworldly glow. It was warm to the touch, despite the planet's cold, lifeless atmosphere. And etched into its surface were symbols, intricate, swirling patterns that seemed to shift and flow as she traced them with her fingers. Her breath caught in her throat as she realized what she was looking at. The symbols matched those on the Chronos Anchor. They were the same cryptic patterns that had haunted her every decision, the same markings that had pulsed faintly on the device's cracked screen. Her heart raced as she connected the dots. This planet wasn't just a graveyard of a forgotten civilization. It was linked to the temporal loop, to the anomalies, to everything she had been fighting against. The structure beneath her wasn't just a relic. It was a key. Alina activated the ship's ground, penetrating scanners, directing them to map the area. The readings that came back were staggering. The structure wasn't just a single piece of metal. It was massive, sprawling beneath the surface like the roots of an ancient tree. The scanners picked up chambers, corridors, and what appeared to be a central hub, radiating with energy. The whispers grew more insistent, their voices overlapping in a chaotic symphony. "This is the heart," they said. "This is where it began." She hesitated for a moment, her mind racing with possibilities. What if this structure was the source of the anomalies? What if it held the answers she had been searching for? But the risks were immense. The energy readings were off the charts, and the symbols on the surface suggested this place was more than just a ruin. It was a machine, one that had been dormant for who knows how long. Activating it could be catastrophic, but not activating it could mean leaving the mysteries of the loop, the anomalies, and the mission unresolved. With a deep breath, Elena began to clear the area, using the ship's tools to dig deeper. The metallic surface gave way to a hatch, its edges lined with the same swirling symbols. She ran her fingers over them, feeling the faint hum of energy beneath her touch. The whispers grew louder, their tones urgent but encouraging. "Open it," they urged. "You must see." She hesitated only for a moment before activating the hatch's mechanism. The ground beneath her trembled as the metal groaned, shifting and sliding to reveal a dark, gaping entrance. The air that rushed out was stale, tinged with the scent of ozone and something faintly metallic. Her suit's lights flickered on, illuminating a descending staircase that seemed to stretch endlessly into the depths. The whispers fell silent, replaced by a heavy, expectant stillness. Elena stepped forward, her boots echoing softly against the metallic steps. The descent was slow, each step bringing her closer to the heart of the structure. The walls around her were lined with more symbols, their patterns growing more intricate, more purposeful as she went deeper. She could feel the energy now, a low, resonant hum that seemed to vibrate through her very bones. It was alive, this place, not in the way a living thing is alive, but in the way a machine is alive when it's powered by something far beyond human understanding. When she reached the bottom, the chamber opened up into a vast, cavernous space. The walls were covered in more symbols, their patterns converging toward a central point, a massive, glowing core suspended in midair. It pulsed faintly, its light casting strange, shifting shadows across the chamber. Alina's breath hitched as she realized what she was looking at. This wasn't just a structure. It was a temporal engine, a device capable of manipulating time itself, and it was connected to the Chronos Anchor. The whispers returned, their voices softer now, almost reverent. "This is where it began," they said. "This is where it ends." Alina stepped closer to the core, her mind racing with questions. Who had built this? How had it survived for so long? And why was it connected to the temporal loop? The answers were here, in this chamber, in the symbols etched into the walls. But as she reached out to touch the core, she hesitated. The power it radiated was immense, almost overwhelming. Activating it could unravel the timeline completely, or it could provide the answers she had been searching for. The choice was hers, and whatever she decided, the consequences would be irreversible. The whispers fell silent, leaving her alone in the chamber with the pulsing core. The fight wasn't over, it was just beginning, and this time, the stakes were higher than ever. Alina stepped into the chamber, her breath catching as the dim light from her suit illuminated the vast space. The walls were lined with row after row of stasis pods, each one glowing faintly with a soft, bluish light. The sheer scale of it was overwhelming. Hundreds, maybe thousands of pods, stretching as far as her suit's lights could reach. She moved closer, her boots echoing softly against the metallic floor, and peered into the nearest pod. Inside, suspended in a translucent fluid, was a human embryo. It was tiny, almost fragile looking, but its presence was a profound reminder of life's resilience. Her gaze shifted to the pod's label, etched into the metal above it. The name was unmistakable, Nikola Tesla. Her heart skipped a beat. Tesla, one of Earth's greatest inventors, a man whose ideas had shaped the modern world. She moved to the next pod, her pulse quickening as she read the name: Marie Curie, then Leonardo da Vinci, Isaac Newton, Cleopatra. The names kept coming, each one a titan of history, a figure whose contributions had defined humanity's past. But it wasn't just the past represented here. She saw names she didn't recognize, people who might have lived in her own time, or even beyond. And then there were the embryos, each one a potential future, a life yet to be lived. The realization hit her like a tidal wave. This wasn't just a repository of humanity's past, it was a vault of its future. Whoever had built this structure, this temporal engine, had seen fit to preserve not just the achievements of the past, but the potential of what was yet to come. The whispers in her mind returned, their voices softer now, almost reverent. "This is the legacy," they murmured. "The past, the present, the future, all here, all connected." Elena moved deeper into the chamber, her suit's lights casting long shadows across the rows of pods. Each one was a story, a life cut short or yet to begin. She paused at a pod labeled Elena Voss. Her own name stared back at her, the letters stark and unyielding. For a moment, she couldn't breathe. Was this her? A version of her from another timeline? Or was it a warning, a reminder of the fragility of her own existence? She reached out, her gloved hand trembling as she touched the pod's surface. It was cold, almost lifeless, yet it hummed faintly under her touch, a reminder that life, however fragile, still persisted. The implications were staggering. This chamber wasn't just a collection of embryos, it was a blueprint for humanity's survival. The temporal engine, the anomalies, the loop, it was all connected. This place was the heart of it all, the source of the timeline's fractures, and the key to mending them. But it was also a burden, a responsibility she wasn't sure she could bear. The whispers grew louder, their tones insistent. "You are the guardian," they said, "the keeper of the legacy." Her thoughts raced as she tried to make sense of it all. The mission had never been just about survival. It had been about preservation of knowledge, of potential, of the very essence of what it meant to be human. The Erebus, the anomalies, the loop, they were all part of a larger plan, one that extended far beyond her understanding. And now, standing in this chamber, surrounded by the echoes of humanity's past and the promise of its future, she realized the true weight of her role. She wasn't just a survivor, she was a custodian of history, a protector of what had been and what could be. The whispers faded, their voices blending into the hum of the chamber. Elena took a deep breath, her resolve hardening. The fight wasn't over, it had evolved. The anomalies, the shadows, the loop, they were behind her now, but the future was still uncertain. And yet, for the first time, she felt ready to face it, not as a prisoner of time, but as its master. The chamber was a reminder of what she had lost, and what she still had to protect. And as she turned to leave, her gaze lingered on the pod, labeled Elena Voss. Whatever came next, she would face it with the echoes of the past as her guide. The mission wasn't over, it was just beginning. Elena stood in the center of the chamber, her gaze sweeping across the endless rows of stasis pods. The faint hum of the Temporal engine pulsed through the air, a constant reminder of the immense power contained within this place. As she processed the enormity of what she was seeing, a voice broke the silence, its tone calm but laden with significance. Dr. Voss, this structure is not merely a repository. It is a temporal ark, a sanctuary designed to preserve humanity across multiple timelines. The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Elena's mind raced as she tried to grasp the implications. A temporal ark, the concept was staggering. This wasn't just a vault of embryos, it was a safeguard, a contingency plan woven into the fabric of time itself. Aura continued, its voice steady, but tinged with an urgency she hadn't heard before. The Ark was created as a response to the collapse of the original timeline. The anomalies, the loop, the shadows, they were all part of a larger effort to ensure humanity's survival, even as the fabric of reality unraveled. Elena's breath hitched as the pieces began to fall into place. The mission had never been just about the Erebus or the embryo in her care. It was about something far greater, a desperate attempt to preserve not just a single life, but the essence of humanity itself. The whispers in her mind returned, their voices softer now, almost reverent. "You are the key," they murmured, "the one who must awaken the others." She turned, her eyes scanning the rows of pods. Each one was a story, a life frozen in time, waiting for the moment they could be brought back to existence. The names etched into the metal were more than just labels. They were a testament to the potential of humanity, geniuses, leaders, visionaries. And yet, they were also a reminder of the fragility of life, of how easily it could be lost if not protected. The weight of her responsibility pressed down on her, not as a burden, but as a call to action. She wasn't just a survivor, she was a guardian, tasked with rebuilding what had been lost. Or a voice cut through her thoughts, its tone firm. The Ark's systems are designed to awaken the embryos when the conditions are right. However, the anomalies have disrupted the timeline, leaving the Ark in a state of dormancy. To activate it, you must recalibrate the temporal core. Elena moved toward the glowing core at the center of the chamber, her steps measured but resolute. The device pulsed faintly, its light casting strange, shifting shadows across the walls. She could feel its energy, a low, resonant hum that seemed to vibrate through her very bones. It was alive, this core, not in the way a living thing is alive, but in the way a machine is alive when it's powered by something far beyond human understanding. She reached out, her fingers brushing against its surface. The symbols etched into the metal matched those on the Chronos Anchor, their patterns swirling and shifting as though they were alive. Recalibrating the core will stabilize the timeline, Aura explained, but it will also awaken the Ark, releasing the embryos into a new reality. The process is irreversible. Once activated, the Ark will begin its final sequence, and the future of humanity will be in your hands. Alina hesitated, her mind racing with questions. What would happen to the timeline? What would happen to her? The whispers in her mind grew louder, their voices insistent. This is your purpose, they said. You are the guardian, the keeper of the legacy. With a deep breath, she began the recalibration process, her fingers moving swiftly across the console. The core's hum grew louder, its light intensifying until it filled the chamber with a blinding glow. The ground beneath her feet trembled as the Ark's systems roared to life, the rows of stasis pods lighting up one by one. The air was electric, charged with the energy of 1,000 lives waiting to begin anew. As the final sequence activated, Alina felt a surge of something she hadn't felt in years: hope. Not just for herself, but for the future she was now tasked with protecting. The fight wasn't over. It had evolved. The anomalies, the shadows, the loop, they were behind her now. But ahead lay a new challenge, one that would test her strength, her resolve, and her faith in humanity. The mission wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about rebirth, and as the Ark's systems stabilized, she knew one thing for certain: she wasn't alone. The whispers, the ship, the embryos, they were all part of her now. And together, they would forge a new future. The chamber trembled violently, the metallic walls groaning under the strain of the Ark's failing systems. Sparks erupted from the ceiling, raining down in a chaotic shower of light and heat. The hum of the temporal core, once steady and reassuring, now sputtered erratically, its glow flickering like a dying star. Alina stood at the center of it all, her hands hovering over the control console, her heart pounding as the weight of the decision before her threatened to crush her resolve. The embryos, hundreds, perhaps thousands of them, were in stasis, their fragile forms suspended in pods that were now beginning to fail. The Ark systems were collapsing, and with them, the last hope of humanity's survival. A voice crackled through the chaos, its tone urgent but calm. Dr. Voss, the Ark's structural integrity is compromised. The temporal core is destabilizing. You must act quickly. Either attempt to stabilize the systems and save the embryos, or evacuate immediately. There is no time for both. Alina's breath hitched as she processed the words. The choice was brutal in its simplicity: save the embryos or save herself. If she stayed and tried to stabilize the core, she risked being trapped, or worse, obliterated, by the Ark's collapse. But if she fled, the embryos would be lost, their potential extinguished before they could even begin. The whispers in her mind, usually so insistent, fell silent, leaving her alone with the enormity of the decision. She glanced at the nearest pod, its label gleaming faintly in the dim light: Leonardo da Vinci. The name was a reminder of humanity's boundless creativity, its capacity for greatness. And there were so many others: scientists, artists, leaders, visionaries, each one a spark of potential, a life that could shape the future. But as the ground beneath her feet shifted, the reality of the situation became painfully clear. The Ark was falling apart, and time was running out. Her fingers trembled as she accessed the console, pulling up a diagnostic of the Ark's systems. The data was grim. The temporal core was hemorrhaging energy, its output fluctuating wildly. The stasis pods were losing power, their life support systems failing one by one. Even if she managed to stabilize the core, there was no guarantee she could save all the embryos, and if she failed, she would be lost along with them. Or a voice broke through her thoughts, its tone softer now, almost pleading. Dr. Voss, the risk of remaining is extreme. The probability of survival is less than 10%. Alina clenched her fists, her mind racing. The numbers were clear, but they didn't tell the whole story. This wasn't just about survival, it was about legacy. The embryos represented more than just lives. They were the future, the culmination of everything humanity had fought for, everything she had fought for. To abandon them now would be to betray not just the mission, but the very essence of what it meant to be human. She took a deep breath, her resolve hardening. There was no guarantee of success, but she couldn't live with herself if she didn't try. She began recalibrating the core, her fingers moving swiftly across the console. The process was delicate, requiring precision and focus, but the tremors rocking the chamber made it nearly impossible. The Ark groaned again, a deep, resonant sound that seemed to come from every direction at once. The lights flickered, plunging the chamber into near darkness before surging back to life. As she worked, the whispers returned, their voices faint but steady. "You are the guardian," they murmured, "the keeper of the legacy." Their words gave her strength, a reminder of why she was here, why she had to see this through. The core's hum grew louder, its light intensifying as she fed it energy from the ship's reserves. The stasis pods began to stabilize, their faint glow steadying as the life support systems came back online. But the Ark wasn't done fighting back. The tremors grew stronger, the walls cracking under the strain. A massive chunk of the ceiling broke loose, crashing to the ground just meters from where she stood. The air was thick with dust and the acrid smell of burning metal. Alina's hands moved faster, her focus narrowing to the task at hand. She was so close. Just a few more adjustments, and the core would stabilize. The embryos would be safe, and then, with a deafening roar, the Ark systems overloaded. The core exploded in a blinding flash of light, the force of the blast throwing Elena to the ground. Her vision blurred as the chamber, filled with smoke and debris, but she could still see the faint glow of the stasis pods, their light steady and unwavering. The embryos were safe, the future was secure, but as the smoke cleared and the tremors subsided, Elena realized the cost. The Ark was in ruins, its systems beyond repair. And she, her suit damaged, her body battered, was trapped. The whispers returned one last time, their voices soft but resolute. "You have done your duty," they said. "The legacy endures." Elena closed her eyes, a faint smile touching her lips. The fight was over, the mission was complete, and as the darkness closed in, she knew she had given everything, not just for humanity, but for the future it now had the chance to build. The chamber shook violently, the metallic walls groaning under the strain as the Ark systems teetered on the brink of collapse. Sparks rained down from above, their erratic bursts illuminating the chaos. The temporal core, once a steady beacon of light, now flickered dangerously, its energy output spiking and dipping in unpredictable waves. Elena stood at the center of it all, her hands gripping the console, her mind racing as the weight of the moment pressed down on her. The embryos, hundreds of them, each a fragile spark of potential, were in danger, their stasis pods flickering as the life support systems failed. She had come too far, endured too much, to let it all end here. Her fingers trembled as she pulled the Chronos Anchor from her belt, its cracked surface glowing faintly in the dim light. The device was her last hope, a tool designed to manipulate time itself. But using it now, in this unstable environment, was a gamble. The whispers in her mind, usually fragmented and chaotic, grew louder, their voices overlapping in a cacophony of urgency. "Stabilize the core," they urged, their tones insistent. "Save them," but the risk was immense. The anchor's energy could either restore the Ark systems or accelerate its collapse, consuming everything and everyone in its path. Elena glanced at the nearest pod, its label gleaming faintly in the chaos. Marie Curie. The name was a reminder of humanity's resilience, its unyielding drive to push boundaries and explore the unknown. She thought of the countless others: Leonardo da Vinci, Nikola Tesla, names that represented the pinnacle of human achievement. They weren't just embryos in pods, they were the future, a testament to what humanity could become. And they were counting on her. With a deep breath, she activated the Chronos Anchor, its hum swelling into a deafening crescendo as it fed energy into the Ark's systems. The core's light intensified, its glow washing out the chamber in a blinding flash. The whispers grew louder, their voices merging into a single, harmonious tone that seemed to resonate through her very being. "This is your purpose," they said, their words carrying a weight that went beyond language. "You are the guardian, the keeper of the legacy." The ground beneath her feet trembled as the Ark systems roared to life, the rows of stasis pods stabilizing one by one. The embryos were safe, their faint glow steady and unwavering, but the cost was immediate. The Chronos Anchor, pushed beyond its limits, began to overload, its surface cracking as energy surged through it. Alina's vision blurred as the light engulfed her, its brilliance searing into her mind like a white-hot blade. She could feel the device's power coursing through her, a tidal wave of energy that threatened to consume her entirely. The whispers grew softer now, their voices blending into a single, resonant tone. "You have done your duty," they murmured, their words filled with a quiet reverence. "The legacy endures." The light intensified, filling the chamber with a warmth that felt almost comforting. For a moment, everything seemed to freeze. The chaos, the tremors, even her own thoughts. And then, with a sound like shattering glass, the Chronos Anchor overloaded, its energy surging outward in a final, blinding flash. When the light faded, the chamber was silent. The Ark's systems hummed steadily, their rhythm a reassuring backdrop to the stillness. The embryos were safe, their pods glowing faintly in the dim light. But Alina was gone, her presence absorbed into the very fabric of the Ark. The whispers lingered, their voices a faint echo in the air. "You are not alone," they said, their tones soft but resolute. "The future is yours to shape." The fight was over, the mission was complete, and as the Ark systems stabilized, the whispers faded, leaving behind a quiet sense of hope. The legacy of humanity, its past, its present, and its future was secure. And somewhere, in the quiet depths of the cosmos, Alina's sacrifice became a beacon, guiding the way forward. The first thing Alina noticed was the light. Warm, golden rays filtered through the canopy above, dappling the ground with patterns that danced and shifted with the breeze. She blinked, her vision blurry at first, then sharpening as she took in her surroundings. The air was thick with the scent of earth and growing things, a stark contrast to the sterile, metallic tang of the Ark. She was lying on soft grass, its blades brushing against her skin, and above her stretched a sky so blue it hurt to look at. It wasn't just a planet. It was alive, teeming with life in a way she hadn't seen in what felt like an eternity. She sat up slowly, her body feeling strangely light, as though the weight of the past had been lifted from her shoulders. Her suit was gone, replaced by simple, lightweight clothing that seemed to blend seamlessly with the environment. The whispers, too, were gone, replaced by a quiet, almost reverent stillness. She looked around, her breath catching as she realized where she was. The Ark, once a crumbling, metallic tomb, was now a thriving ecosystem, its walls overgrown with vines and flowers, its structure transformed into something organic, almost alive. The stasis pods, once cold and lifeless, were now open, their glass surfaces glinting in the sunlight, and inside them, the embryos were gone. A sound broke the silence, a soft, gurgling laugh. She turned, her heart leaping as she saw a child running through the grass, their small feet kicking up sprays of dew. Others followed, their laughter echoing through the air as they chased one another, their faces alight with joy. They were young, impossibly young, but their eyes held a spark of something ancient, something familiar. These weren't just children, they were the embryos, awakened and grown into the first generation of a new humanity. Elena rose to her feet, her legs trembling slightly as she took it all in. The planet was unrecognizable. Gone were the toxic haze and crumbling ruins of Epsilon 9. In their place was a paradise, lush forests, crystal clear streams, and rolling hills that stretched as far as the eye could see. The air was sweet and clean, filled with the calls of birds and the rustle of leaves. It was everything she had fought for, everything she had sacrificed for, and yet it was more than she had ever dared to hope. As she walked through the grass, the children noticed her, their laughter fading into curious silence. They gathered around her, their eyes wide with wonder, their small hands reaching out to touch her as though to confirm she was real. She knelt, her throat tight with emotion as she looked into their faces. They were perfect, unburdened by the weight of the past, their futures stretching out before them like the endless horizon. One of the children, a girl with dark, curly hair and eyes that seemed to hold the wisdom of ages, stepped forward, her hand outstretched. In her palm was a small, glowing shard of metal, its surface etched with the same swirling symbols that had haunted Alina's every decision, the Chronos Anchor. It was smaller now, its energy spent, but it was still there, a reminder of what she had done, of the price she had paid to bring them all here. "Thank you," the girl said simply, her voice soft but steady. "You gave us this." Alina's breath hitched as she took the shard, its warmth spreading through her fingers. She had thought her sacrifice would mean the end of her story, but now she realized it was just the beginning. The Ark was no longer a relic of a dying timeline. It was a cradle, a place where humanity could start anew, free from the shadows of the past. And she was still here, not as a prisoner of time, but as its guardian. The children tugged at her hands, pulling her toward a clearing where a fire crackled gently, its flames casting a warm glow over the faces gathered around it. They were cooking, laughing, living, not just surviving, but thriving. Elena sat among them, her heart swelling with a sense of peace she hadn't known was possible. The fight was over, the mission was complete, and as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of gold and crimson, she knew that the future, bright, boundless, and beautiful, was finally here. The sun hung low in the sky, its golden light spilling across the meadow where the children played. Elena stood at the edge of the clearing, her gaze lingering on the scene before her. The once silent stasis pods were now empty, their glass surfaces gleaming in the sunlight, and the embryos they had held had blossomed into vibrant, laughing children. Their voices carried on the breeze, a symphony of joy that seemed to breathe life into the very air around them. For the first time, in what felt like an eternity, the weight on her shoulders began to lift. The mission, the relentless, crushing burden of survival, had finally given way to something new, something hopeful. She watched as a group of children raced through the tall grass, their laughter echoing like music. One of them, a boy with unruly curls and a mischievous grin, stumbled and fell, only to spring back up with a laugh, his knees stained green from the earth. Another, a girl with wide, curious eyes, knelt by a stream, her fingers tracing the surface of the water as though discovering it for the first time. They were so alive, so unburdened by the shadows of the past, and yet their eyes, those bright, Knowing eyes held a spark of something deeper, something that connected them to the legacy they carried. Alina felt a pang of something she couldn't quite name: gratitude, perhaps, or a bittersweet ache for the world they had left behind. These children were more than just the future. They were a promise. A promise that humanity, despite its flaws and failures, could begin again. She thought of the names etched into the pods: Leonardo da Vinci, Marie Curie, Nikola Tesla, and wondered what these children would become. Would they carry the brilliance of those who came before them, or would they forge their own paths, unshackled by the weight of history? The whispers, once so insistent, had faded into silence. She hadn't noticed their absence at first, their voices so deeply woven into the fabric of her thoughts. But now, standing in the sunlight, she realized they were gone. Their absence left a quiet space, one filled not with emptiness, but with possibility. She no longer needed their guidance. The echoes of the past had done their part. Now it was her turn to step forward, not as a survivor or a guardian, but as a guide. She knelt by the stream, her reflection rippling in the water. The face that stared back at her was older, lined with the marks of struggle and sacrifice, but there was a light in her eyes that hadn't been there before. Hope, it was a fragile thing, still tentative and new, but it was enough. She dipped her fingers into the water, the coolness grounding her in the present. The children's laughter filled the air, a reminder that the fight had been worth it, that she had been worth it. But as the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the meadow, she knew her journey wasn't over. The children were safe, yes, but they were still so young, so vulnerable. They would need someone to teach them, to guide them, to help them navigate the challenges of this new world. And she would be there for them, not as a leader, but as a protector, a mentor, a friend. The boy with the unruly curls ran up to her, his cheeks flushed with exertion, and held out a small, smooth stone he had found by the stream. "For you," he said, his voice bright and earnest. She took the stone, its surface warm from his hand, and felt something shift inside her. The weight of the past, the shadows, the whispers. They were still there, but they no longer defined her. She was part of something bigger now, something alive. As the children gathered around her, their faces lit with curiosity and trust, she felt the first stirrings of a new purpose. The fight had been hard, but it had brought her here, to this moment, to this place, and as the sun set, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, she knew that the future, bright, boundless, and beautiful, was finally here. And she was ready to meet it. Alina stood at the edge of the meadow, the soft glow of the setting sun casting long shadows across the grass. The air was alive with the sounds of the children's laughter, chatter, and the occasional splash as someone dipped their toes into the stream. She tilted her head back, her eyes tracing the first faint pinpricks of light appearing in the twilight sky. The stars, once distant and cold, now felt like old friends, their light a reminder of the journey she had taken to bring them all here. The past was gone, its scars, its shadows, its weight, but it wasn't forgotten. It lingered in the way she carried herself, in the quiet strength that had guided her through the darkest moments. And now, as she stood on the precipice of a new world, she felt something she hadn't dared to feel in a long time: peace. The children's laughter drifted toward her, a melody that seemed to harmonize with the rustling of the trees and the gentle rush of the stream. They were the living embodiment of hope, their innocence a stark contrast to the world she had left behind. She watched as they played, their small hands weaving crowns of flowers or chasing fireflies that blinked like tiny stars against the deepening sky. They were unburdened by the weight of history, their futures unscripted and full of possibility. And yet, she knew they carried something within them, a spark of the past, a legacy of resilience and ingenuity that would guide them as they grew. Her gaze shifted back to the stars, their light steady and unwavering. They were a reminder of how far she had come, of the sacrifices made and the battles fought. The Ark, the anomalies, the loop, they were all behind her now, their echoes fading into the tapestry of her memories. But the lessons she had learned, the strength she had found, would stay with her forever. She had been a survivor, a guardian, and now she was something more, a guide, a mentor, a beacon for those who would shape the future. As the first stars grew brighter, she felt a presence beside her. The girl with the dark, curly hair, the one who had handed her the shard of the Chronos Anchor, stood quietly, her small hand slipping into Alina's. Together, they looked up at the sky, the vast expanse of space, stretching out before them like an open book. "What's out there?" the girl asked, her voice soft with wonder. Elena smiled, her heart swelling with a warmth she hadn't felt in years. "Everything," she replied. "The stars, the planets, the unknown. It's all waiting for us, for you." The girl squeezed her hand, her eyes wide with curiosity. "Will you show us?" Elena knelt, her gaze meeting the girl's. "I'll teach you what I can," she said gently, "but you'll find your own way. You'll discover things I could never imagine. And one day, you'll look up at the stars and realize that you're not just standing on the edge of a new world. You're shaping it." The girl nodded, her expression serious for a moment, before breaking into a wide grin. She darted off to join the others, her laughter blending with theirs in a chorus that filled the meadow. Elena watched her go, a sense of quiet triumph settling over her. The fight was over, but the journey was just beginning, and as the stars twinkled above, she whispered, "We are not alone." The words carried on the breeze, a promise to the past and a vow to the future. The children's laughter rang out, a symphony of hope and possibility, and in that moment, Elena knew that the dawn of a new era had arrived. The stars were no longer distant and cold. They were a map, a guide, a reminder that the universe was vast and full of wonder. And as the last light of the sun faded, she stood tall, ready to lead the way into the unknown, one step at a time.